Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into one of history's most fascinating and, let's be honest, hypocritical periods, the Italian Renaissance, but seen through the eyes of its most powerful and problematic figures, the popes. We're talking about men who were supposed to be God's representatives on earth, but often acted more like mafia dons. It's a story of such extreme contrast that if you pitched it as a TV show, producers might say, it's a bit unbelievable, you'd probably not survive your first week in their Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly means the world, and while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The dust from the road cakes the back of your throat. For weeks you've been traveling towards this one destination, the center of the Christian world, the eternal city Rome. In your mind, it's a place of shimmering gold, marble columns and holy hymns sung by angels. The reality, as you pass through the ancient Aurelian walls, is a little different. And by a little I mean a lot. The year is somewhere in the late 15th century. The air is thick with the smell you cocktail of livestock, wood smoke, cheap wine, incense, and something else, something foul, rising from the muddy streets. The grand avenues you imagined are narrow, winding lanes, crowded with a chaotic mix of people. Pilgrims with wide, hopeful eyes jostle past swaggering mercenaries whose hands never stray far from the hilts of their swords. Merchants hawk their wares from rickety stalls, their voices a constant, buzzing drone beneath the clang of 1,000 church bells. You see the remnants of ancient glory everywhere, but not as pristine monuments. The Colosseum in the distance isn't a tourist attraction, it's a ruin. Its stone arches filled in with shabby housing, its corridors used as workshops and its structure plundered for building materials. Herds of goats graze where Roman senators once debated, chewing thoughtfully among the fallen columns of the Forum. This isn't just a city, it's a living archaeological dig, where the past is being actively recycled and often disrespected to build the future. This is the great project of the Renaissance popes. After a long, messy period where the papacy wasn't even based in Rome, they have returned with a vengeance and a vision. Their goal is to make Rome the undisputed capital of the world once more, a new Jerusalem, a city so magnificent that its splendor would physically prove the power and glory of God, and by extension themselves. So everywhere you look, something is being built. The clink of stonemasons' chisels is the city's unofficial theme song. New palaces, new churches, and the foundations of what will one day be the new street. Peter's Basilica are rising from the medieval squalor. But this grand urban renewal project has a dark underbelly. One of the more peculiar and frankly gross little facts about Renaissance Rome is its sanitation, or lack thereof. The ancient Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, was centuries past its prime. For most of the populace, waste disposal meant tossing it out the window into the street below. The Tiber River, which winds its way through the city, isn't a romantic waterway, it's a dumping ground for everything from butcher's scraps to human waste. It's a beautiful, gilded city that smells. You watch as a procession of cardinals sweeps by, their scarlet robes a slash of brilliant color against the earthy tones of the street. They are surrounded by guards, their faces impassive and stern. The crowd parts before them like the Red Sea, people bowing their heads in reverence. Yet just a few feet away, a beggar with missing teeth and dirt-streaked skin holds out a trembling hand, utterly ignored. The sacred and the profane, the magnificent and the miserable, are not just neighbors here, they're roommates, sharing the same cramped, chaotic space. And this is a point that historians still debate endlessly. Was the Renaissance truly rebirth for the city, a golden age of art and enlightenment, or was that just the experience of the wealthy elite, the cardinals, the bankers, the powerful families? For the average person you see around you, life is precarious. Taxes are high to pay for all this new construction and the lavish lifestyles of the church leaders. Justice is a commodity that can be bought and sold. The streets are policed by private armies loyal to competing noble houses, not to the public good. It's a city of immense creative energy, but also of deep, gnawing paranoia. You find a place to stay for the night, a room in a crowded inn. As you look out your window, You can see the faint glow of the Vatican Hill across the river. It feels like a separate world. That is the heart of it all. All the money, all the power, all the ambition, and all the contradictions of this city flow from that one place. It is ruled by one man, who holds a title unlike any other on the planet. He is a king, a priest, and in the eyes of the faithful, the living link between heaven and earth. And to understand this city, you must first understand the man on its throne. From your window, the Vatican doesn't just glow, it looms. It's the source of all the city's nervous energy, its magnificent construction projects, and its deep-seated paranoia. To understand Rome, you have to understand the man who rules from that hill. And his job description is, to put it mildly, unique. The Pope is not just a priest. Yes, not just a priest. He is, for all intents and purposes, the CEO of Western Christendom. Think of the largest multinational corporation you can imagine, but instead of selling software or smartphones, it deals in the currency of eternal salvation. His spiritual power is absolute and comes from a single, powerful story that every child in Europe learns. You see it depicted in paintings and sculptures all over the city, Jesus giving a set of keys to his disciple Peter. Those are the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The Pope was the successor to Street. Peter holds those keys. This isn't just a metaphor to the people around you, it is a tangible, terrifying reality. It means the Pope can lock you out of heaven. This power is called excommunication, and for a ruler or a commoner in this age, it's the spiritual equivalent of a nuclear option. It severs you from the church, from God, and from the community of the faithful. But he can go bigger. If a king gets on his bad side, he can place an entire kingdom under an interdict. Imagine all churches in your country being closed. No masses, no marriages, no marriages, no marriages, no marriages, no marriages, no last rites. The king's subjects, terrified for their immortal souls, would likely revolt. This is how popes have brought emperors to their knees. He can annul the marriages of monarchs, declare wars to be just crusades, and his blessing can legitimize a usurper's claim to a throne. This is power far beyond armies and gold. It's the power to direct the conscience of a continent. Then there's the other side of his portfolio, the temporal power. The Pope is a monarch, a king in his own right. The lands he rules directly are called the Papal States, a wide and unruly swath of territory that cuts right across the middle of the Italian peninsula. You could travel for days, from the fertile plains of Remagen in the north down to the countryside surrounding Rome itself, and you would never leave the Pope's domain. He has his own army, often composed of brutal mercenaries, his own tax collectors, his own judges, and his own crumbling fortresses. Managing this territory is a constant, messy headache. Rebellious cities, feuding noble families who think the Pope's lands are their personal playground, and the constant threat of invasion from neighboring powers like Naples or France. It's a full-time job for any secular ruler. So, the man on the throne has to be two things at once: a pious spiritual guide leading a flock of 100 million souls, and a hard-nosed political operator playing the cutthroat game of Italian power politics. It's a combination that, as you'll soon see, can lead to some interesting compromises in morality. As you sit in the common room of the inn, you might overhear two men in modest clerical robes whispering. This is where you pick up on one of the stranger, and more revealing, aspects of how this whole enterprise is funded. They're talking about buying an office. This is a practice known as simony, and while it's officially a sin, here it's an art form. The papal bureaucracy is immense, with hundreds of cushy, lucrative jobs: apostol, executaries, proto notaries, abbreviators. And many of these positions can be bought for a hefty sum. It's a bizarrely niche little fact that the papal court had a price list for these jobs. You weren't just buying a title, you were buying an investment. Once you had the office, you could charge fees for your services, effectively earning back your initial payment and then some. It's a system rife with corruption, turning the administration of the Holy See into a marketplace. And this brings us to a question that historians still wrestle with: where did this idea of the Pope as a king, a landed monarch, even come from for centuries? The Church's justification for its worldly power rested on a single document, the donation of Constantine. The story goes that the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, was cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I in the 4th century. He supposedly donated the entire Western Roman Empire to the Pope and his successors before moving his own capital to Constantinople. For 1,000 years, this document was the legal bedrock of the papacy's temporal power. The only problem, it was a complete forgery, likely cooked up in the 8th century by a clever cleric in the papal chancery. By your time in the 15th century, scholars were already starting to prove it was a fake. This leads to a fascinating debate. Did the popes of your era know they were ruling based on a lie? Some historians argue they were, that their claim was based on a fraud, but using it anyway as a convenient tool of statecraft. Others suggest that the document had been considered real for so long that it had become a kind of institutional truth, its authenticity no longer questioned by the men whose power depended on it. They may have believed it in the way one believes in a founding myth, not as a literal fact, but as a story that explains why the world is the way it is. The power of the Pope, both spiritual and temporal, rests on the idea that he is one, singular, divinely appointed authority, the keystone in the arch of Christendom. But as you drift off to sleep, with the sounds of the chaotic city murmuring outside your window, a troubling thought might occur to you. What would happen if that keystone cracked? What if the singular authority wasn't so singular after all? What if, instead of one pope, there were 2 or even 3, all claiming to hold the keys to heaven and all excommunicating each other? That sounds like a recipe for disaster. And for the Church, it had been a very recent and very public disaster indeed. The memory of the disaster is still fresh in the minds of everyone around you, a lingering institutional trauma. It's the kind of embarrassing family secret that gets whispered about at holiday dinners, except this family is the entire Catholic Church. You're learning about the period they call the Great Schism, or more accurately the Western Schism. It was a crisis that almost broke the papacy, and its aftershocks are a big reason why the popes you're about to meet are so obsessed with power and control. To understand it, you have to rewind the clock about 100 years before your arrival in Rome. Imagine this: the papacy packed its bags and left. For most of the 14th century, the popes weren't in Rome at all. Under pressure from the powerful French monarchy, they relocated to Avignon, a pleasant city in what is now southern France. This period is often called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. The popes lived in a magnificent palace, but they were widely seen as puppets of the French king. Abandoned by its spiritual and political leader, fell into the state of disrepair you saw when you arrived, a ghost of its former self, run by feuding, thuggish nobles. Finally, in 1377, Pope Gregory X was convinced, largely by the impassioned pleas of a mystic named Catherine of Siena, to move the papacy back to Rome. The city rejoiced. The crisis was over, or so they thought. When Gregory died a year later, the Roman people were terrified that the cardinals, most of whom were French, would elect another Frenchman who would immediately pack up and run back to Avignon. A mob gathered outside the Vatican, chanting Romano Lovio Elimo. We want a Roman. They made it very clear that if a non-Italian was elected, the cardinals might not leave the conclave alive. Under this intense pressure, the cardinals chose an Italian, Urban VI. Phew, crisis averted. Except, it turned out Urban VI was difficult. He was arrogant, had a volcanic temper, and immediately started berating the cardinals, threatening to strip them of their wealth and power. The French cardinals quickly had a bad case of buyer's remorse. They fled Rome, gathered in a nearby town, and issued a stunning declaration. They claimed they had elected Urban under duress, meaning the election was invalid. And then they did the unthinkable. They elected their own pope, a Frenchman, who took the name Clement VI and promptly moved back to Avignon. Now you have a situation that tears Christendom in half. There are 2 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon. Both men claimed to be the one true vicar of Christ. Both had their own college of cardinals. Both excommunicated the other and all his followers. Europe had to choose sides. France, Scotland, and parts of Spain backed the Avignon Pope. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy backed the Roman Pope. It was a spiritual Cold War. 2 men were selling salvation from 2 different storefronts. each claiming the other was a fraud and an antitrust. The damage to the church's prestige was catastrophic. How can you claim to be the one, indivisible authority on earth when there are two of you? The situation descended even further into farce. In an attempt to fix the mess, a council of church leaders met at Pisa in 1409. Their brilliant solution deposed both popes and elect a new, third one, Alexander V. But the popes in Rome and Avignon refused to step down. So now, you have three popes, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. It was an absolute mess. Historians still debate the true canonical legitimacy of the popes from this era. Was there ever a true pope during the schism, or was the seat of Peter effectively vacant? It's a theological and historical minefield. Here's a small, weird detail from this chaotic time. When the Pisan Council elected their third pope, Alexander V, he soon died and was succeeded by a man named Baldassare, who took the name John XXIII. This John XXIII, a mercenary captain, widely believed to have been a pirate in his youth. The idea of a pirate becoming pope sounds like fiction, but it was the bizarre reality of the schism. His name was so tarnished that it wasn't used again for over 500 years, until a new Pope John XXIII was elected in 1958, a move that subtly declared the first one an antipope. The schism was finally healed by the Council of Constance in 1417. They managed to depose or get resignations from all three popes and elect a new, single pope to rule from Rome, Martin B. The papacy was whole again. But the scars ran deep. The popes of your era, the ones of the later 15th century, are the direct inheritors of this legacy. They learned crucial lessons from the Great Schism. First, they became deeply suspicious of any challenge to their authority, especially from councils. They were determined never again to let a group of bishops and cardinals tell them what to do. The idea of concilia is that a church council could be a higher authority than the pope was brutally suppressed. The popes would reassert the principle of absolute papal monarchy. Second, and perhaps more importantly, they realized that their power and independence depended on being strong secular rulers. They had seen what happened when the papacy was weakened at the mercy of foreign kings or Roman mobs. The solution was to make the papal states a strong, centralized, and powerful kingdom that could stand on its own. They needed money. They needed to crush any internal dissent from the unruly noble families who had run wild while the popes were away. This is the psychological backdrop for everything you're about to witness. The popes of the Renaissance aren't just greedy or power-hungry for the sake of it. They are operating from a place of deep institutional insecurity. They believe that to protect the church, they must become powerful kings. And to become powerful kings, they would have to start acting like them, which meant playing the dirty, cynical, and often brutal game of Italian politics. The stage was set for a new kind of pope, one who was less concerned with saving souls and more concerned with consolidating power. The great families of Italy saw their opportunity. The papacy was no longer just a spiritual office, it was the ultimate prize in a dynastic game of thrones. The healing of the Great Schism created a power vacuum, but not the kind you might think. With the papacy firmly re-established in Rome and determined to become a major political force, a new game began. The most powerful and ambitious families of Italy, who had long treated the peninsula as their personal chessboard, now saw the ultimate prize. Why just influence a pope when you could be the pope, or better yet, have one of your family members on the throne of St. Peter? The papacy was about to become a family business. You're standing in a Roman piazza, maybe the Piazza Navona, which is still just a large, muddy field at this point, but it's a hub of activity. All around you, the conversation is about names, not first names. Colonna, Orsini, Della Rovere, Medici, Sforza, and a new name whispered with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity: Borgia. These aren't just families, they are clans, corporate dynasties with their own armies, their own territories, and their own fiercely guarded identities. For centuries, the two great Roman baronial families, the Colonna and the Orsini, had treated the city and the surrounding countryside as their personal fiefdom. They had a violent, blood-soaked rivalry that had gone on for generations, and the election of a new pope was often the trigger for fresh conflict. If the new pope favored the Colonna, the Orsini would rebel, and vice versa. Their fortified towers dotted the Roman landscape, grim reminders of who held the real power on the streets. The popes who came after the schism knew they had to break the power of these Roman barons. But how the strategy they adopted was, ironically, to beat the families at their own game. It was a strategy called nepotism, and it would come to define the Renaissance papacy. The word nepotis, the Latin word for nephew. Nepos, a pope couldn't have a legitimate son to inherit his power, of course. But he had nephews. And cousins. And nephews who were, wink wink, actually his own children. So, a new pope would come to power, and his first move would be to elevate his relatives to positions of immense wealth and influence. His favorite nephew would be made a cardinal nephew becoming the pope's right-hand man and chief political fixer. Other relatives would be given command of the papal armies, made rulers of papal cities, or married off to the children of other powerful dukes and princes to form strategic alliances. The goal was to create a loyal power base within the church and the papal states, a dynasty that could counteract the influence of the old, entrenched families like the Colonna and the Orsini. The popes were essentially creating their own mafias to fight the established ones. This system turned the College of Cardinals, the august body that elects the pope, into a hotbed of dynastic ambition. When a pope died, the conclave to elect his successor wasn't a spiritual retreat for prayerful deliberation. It was a political convention, a marketplace of bribes, threats, and backroom deals. Each of the great families would have their own faction of cardinals, all maneuvering to get their candidate, or at least a friendly one, elected. They weren't just electing a holy father, they were choosing a CEO who would control the family firm for the next few years. This leads to one of those strange, almost comical details of papal elections. The cardinals were, and still are, sealed inside the apostolic palace for the duration of the conclave. The word conclave literally means with a key. In your time, this was taken very seriously. The food passed to the cardinals through a small hatch was deliberately made more meager as the days went on, a tactic to encourage a quicker decision. But the weirder part was what happened outside. A period of lawlessness often descended on Rome. A tradition, which historians are still a bit fuzzy on the origins of, allowed the Roman people to sack the residence of the deceased pope. It was an unofficial, but widely accepted, perk of the transition of power. Even stranger, some sources claim that the house of the newly elected pope was also fair game, a sort of chaotic celebration of his victory. This is a point of some debate. Was it the old pope's house, the new ones, or both? Either way, it highlights the chaotic and predatory nature of the city's politics. The popes who emerged from this system were a new breed. Take Pope VI a Della Rovere. He was a former scholar from a humble background. But once elected, he went into full dynasty-building mode. He made no fewer than 6 of his nephews cardinals, giving them so much power and wealth that they lived like kings. One of them, Pietro Rio, became infamous for his obscenely lavish parties. Another, Giuliano della Rovere, the future Pope Julius II, became a formidable political player in his own right. Sixth IV was also the pope who instigated the Pozzi conspiracy, an attempt to assassinate the Medici rulers of Florence, in the middle of High Mass in the city's cathedral. This wasn't a spiritual leader, this was a Renaissance prince, using the tools of the papacy to advance his family's interest. And this is the world you find yourself in. It's a world where holiness is a useful political tool, but family loyalty is paramount. The air is thick with ambition. Every great family in Italy is looking for their chance. They're opening to seize the greatest prize of all. They are watching the current pope, innocent VI, grow old and feeble. They are positioning their pieces on the board, making alliances, and counting their gold. And among the players, there's one family that is about to change the game forever. They aren't from Rome or even from Italy. They are outsiders from Spain, a land viewed with suspicion by the Italian elite. Their name is Borgia. They have already had one family member on the papal throne a generation earlier, Calixtus II. He was the one who first brought his nephews to Rome, giving them a foothold in this treacherous world. One of those nephews was a man named Rodrigo Borgia. He has been quietly, patiently, skillfully playing the game, accumulating vast wealth, and waiting for his moment. And as the 15th century nears its end, that moment is about to arrive. The name Borgia is spoken in the wine shops and palace corridors of Rome with a very specific inflection, a mixture of grudging respect and deep-seated xenophobia. To the established Roman families, like the Orsinian Colonna, the Borgias are upstarts. Worse, they're foreigners. In the intensely parochial world of Italian politics, being from another city was bad enough. Being from another country was a cardinal sin, no pun intended. They were Catalans, from the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain, and they never let you forget it. Your first real glimpse of the Borgia family's influence isn't through spectacle or violence, but through their quiet, pervasive presence. You see their coat of arms everywhere, a red bull on a field of gold. It's a symbol of strength, virility, and, to their enemies, brute force. They arrived in Rome a few decades ago, riding the coattails of Alphonse de Borgia, who was elected Pope Calixtus II in 1455. Calixtus II was old when he was elected, seen as a caretaker pope, but he used his short reign to do what all popes of the era did. He practiced nepotism on an industrial scale. He made two of his nephews cardinals. One was a young man of limited ability. The other was his sister's son, Rodrigo Borgia. Young, handsome, intelligent, and impossibly charming, Rodrigo was a natural at the game of Vatican politics. He was made a cardinal in his 20s and quickly appointed vice-chancellor of the Holy Roman Church. This was one of the most powerful and lucrative positions in the entire papal court. The vice-chancellor was essentially the pope's chief administrator and prime minister, controlling the vast machinery of the papal bureaucracy and, more importantly, its finances. For the next 35 years, through the reigns of 4 different popes, Rodrigo Borgia held this position. Think about that. While popes came and went, while their families rose and fell, Rodrigo remained. He was the ultimate survivor, the consummate insider. He served his masters well, but he served himself better. He was patient, observant, and breathtakingly corrupt. He used his office to amass a fortune that was obscene even by the standards of the day. He controlled numerous bishoprics and monasteries across Europe, all of which sent a steady stream of revenue flowing into his coffers. He was charming, politically astute, and knew where every single skeleton was buried in the Vatican. But what truly set him apart, and what made the Roman elite so deeply uncomfortable, was his personal life. Popes and cardinals of this era were not in the breach than the observance. Many had mistresses and fathered children who were passed off as nephews. But Rodrigo Borgia was different. He was open about it. He didn't hide his family. His long-term mistress, a beautiful but obscure Roman woman named Van Ozad Icetanii, was the mother of his 4 children who would become world-famous Giovanni or Juan, Cesare, Lucretia, and Joffer. He loved them, doted on them, and was ruthlessly ambitious for them. This was not the discreet hypocrisy. The Romans were used to. This was a flagrant, almost defiant, rejection of appearances. He was behaving like a secular prince, establishing a dynasty, and he wasn't apologizing for it. This leads to a quirky little tidbit of history. While Venosia was his most famous mistress, his last great love was a woman named Julia Fancy. She was known as Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful, and was renowned throughout Italy for her stunning looks. She was married to an Orsini, but was the open and acknowledged mistress of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia. Her situation gave rise to a cutting nickname for her in the gossipy courts of Rome. They called her the Bride of Christ, blasphemous joke that captured the essence of the era's corruption. Her own brother, Alessandro Fancy, was made a cardinal by Rodrigo. The Romans, in their typical sarcastic fashion, nicknamed him the Petticoat Cardinal, implying he owed his red hat to his sister's influence in the bedroom. Ironically, this petticoat cardinal would one day become the highly respected Pope III, the Pope who initiated the Catholic Reformation. So as Pope Innocent VII lies on his deathbed in the summer of 1492, the city holds its breath. Rodrigo Borgia, now the most senior and wealthiest cardinal, sees his chance. The 2 main Italian contenders for the papal throne are Giuliano della Roba, the nephew of the former popes. Sixtus IV and Toscanos was the brother of the powerful Duke of Milan. Della Rovere is fearsome and respected, but also widely disliked for his explosive temper. Sforza is a kingmaker, a master of political maneuvering. And here historians still debate the true genius of Rodrigo Borgia's campaign. Was he a master strategist who had been planning this for decades, or was he simply the man with the deepest pocket at the right moment? The traditional view, popularized by his enemies, is that he simply bought the papacy. He had the money, and he used it. But some modern historians argue it was more complex. They suggest that many cardinals saw him as the safe choice. He was an experienced administrator who knew how to make the system work. He wasn't a hothead like Della Rovere, and he wasn't directly tied to one of the great Italian powers like Sforza. He was the continuity candidate, the man who could keep the ship running smoothly. Whatever the reasoning, the stage is set for a conclave that will go down in history. The cardinals are filing into the Vatican, ready to be locked away from the world. But they are not just carrying their piety and their prayers. They are carrying their ambitions, their family loyalties, and their price tags. Rodrigo Borgia has his war chest ready. The bull is about to be let loose in the holy corridors of the Vatican. You can almost feel the ground shake. The most notorious papacy in history is about to begin. The summer of 1492 is thick with heat and anticipation. Pope Innocent VII is dead, and the cardinals are sealed inside the Sistine Chapel for the conclave. The stakes have never been higher. Outside, the city of Rome is a tinderbox of rumors and bets. Money is changing hands as people wager on who will emerge from that chapel as the next vicar of Christ. Inside, however, a different kind of transaction is taking place, one that will become the stuff of legend. You are a fly on the wall in that sacred space. The air heavy with the scent of incense and sweat. The frescoes on the walls, painted by the masters of the age, depict scenes from the life of Moses and Christ. But the men gathered below are engaged in a far more worldly business. The two front-runners, Giuliano della Rovere and Ascanio Sforza, quickly find themselves in a stalemate. Neither can gather the required two-thirds majority. Their factions are too evenly matched, their mutual hatred too strong. This is the moment Rodrigo Borgia has been waiting for his entire life. He lets the other to wear each other out. He plays the role of the elder statesman, the patient administrator, the voice of reason. But behind the scenes, his agents are working tirelessly. The traditional story, and the one his enemies would shout from the rooftops, is one of shameless, blatant bribery. The account that has come down through history is that mule loads of silver were sent from Borgia's palace to the palace of Ascanio Sforza to secure his support. It's an image so vivid and cinematic it's hard to resist. A train of animals laden with treasure, trotting through the Roman night by the papacy. In exchange for his vote and the votes of his faction, Sforza was promised the now vacant and incredibly powerful position of vice-chancellor, along with Borgia's own magnificent palace. Other cardinals were promised rich bishoprics, titles, land, and cold, hard cash. One was bribed with a lucrative abbey in France. Another was won over with the promise of a castle. It was an auction for the soul of the church, and Rodrigo Borgia was the highest bidder. On the night of August 10th, the deal was struck. The next morning, the white smoke rose from the chimney, and the senior cardinal deacon appeared on the balcony to announce the words the city was waiting for: Habemus Popum, we have a pope. The man elected was Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Alexander VI. The Roman people, at first, were ecstatic. Alexander VI was a known quantity. He was seen as a man of action, a brilliant administrator who would bring order to the lawless city. He was also known for his charm and his love of spectacle. His coronation was one of the most magnificent the city had ever seen, a lavish parade of wealth and power that seemed to promise a glorious new era. But in the palaces of the Italian elite, and especially in the heart of his defeated rival, Giuliano della Rovere, the reaction was one of horror and fury. They knew exactly how he had won, and they would never let him forget it. Now, here's a small, fascinating detail about the mechanics of a papal election. The voting was done by secret ballot, with each cardinal writing his choice on a piece of paper. To ensure secrecy and fairness, the ballots had a complex system of folding and sealing. But the most interesting part is what they did with the ballots after the count. They were burned in a small stove, and chemicals were added to the fire to produce either white smoke for a successful election or black smoke for a failed one. It's a beautifully simple system. However, for centuries there was no single, universally agreed upon chemical formula, leading to many confusing instances of greyish smoke that left the crowds outside guessing. The current, more reliable method is a relatively modern invention. In Alexander VI's time, the system was much more rudimentary. The election of Alexander VI is a watershed moment, but historians are still engaged in a lively debate over the specifics of his bribery. Was it really as crude as mule loads of silver, or was it more a matter of sophisticated promises and political horse trading? The most damning accounts of the conclave come from sources deeply hostile to the Borgias, particularly the diary of a Vatican master of ceremonies named Johann Burchard, who chronicled every scandal with meticulous, almost gleeful detail. Some modern historians argue that while bribery certainly happened, it was the norm in papal elections of the era. Alexander VI wasn't unique in buying the office, he was just better at it and less apologetic about it. They suggest the mule load story might be an exaggeration, a piece of brilliant anti-Borgia propaganda that stuck, because it was so believable. Did he buy the papacy? Almost certainly. Was it a straightforward cash transaction? The truth is likely a more complex tapestry of promises, threats, and dynastic ambitions. Whatever the exact nature of the deal, the result was the same. A man who had openly fathered for children, who lived like a secular prince, and who had just bought the holiest office in Christendom, was now sitting on the throne of St. Peter. He was Pope Alexander VI. His family, the Borgias, were no longer just players in the game. They now owned the entire casino. And Alexander had big plans for his children. They weren't just going to be rich nobles, they were going to be the foundation of a new, permanent Borgia dynasty that would dominate Italy for generations to come. The Holy Father had become a godfather, and his first order of business was to take care of the family. Now that you're the Pope, what's your first move if you're Alexander VI? The answer is simple: bring on the family. The ink was barely dry on his papal election certificate before he began elevating his children to positions of power and prestige that made the nepotism of previous popes look like amateur hour. The Romans, who were used to popes discreetly favoring a nephew or two, watched with a kind of stunned disbelief. Alexander didn't just favor his children, he unleashed them upon Italy. Let's meet the cast of characters, the four Borgia children who would dominate the headlines and gossip of your era. They were the children of his longtime mistress, Venosi Zad Catanei, and he loved them with a fierce, almost smothering intensity. First there was Giovanni, or Juan in the Spanish fashion. He was the eldest, and by all accounts, the Pope's absolute favorite. Juan was handsome, charming, and utterly spoiled. He was also arrogant, lazy, and not particularly bright. Alexander saw him as the future secular arm of the Borgia family. He showered Juan with titles and land, making him the Duke of Gandia in Spain and, more importantly, the Gonfaloniere, or commander-in-chief, of the papal armies. The plan was for Juan to be the great military leader who would carve out a kingdom for the Borgias in the heart of Italy. There was just one problem: Juan was a terrible soldier. He was far more interested in the parties and pleasures of Rome than in the grit and discipline of the battlefield. Then there was Cesare. Oh, Cesare, if one was the handsome, popular one, Cesare was the dark, brooding, and terrifyingly competent one. He was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. While his father had earmarked him for a career in the church, the traditional path for a second son, it was a role that fit him like a straitjacket. Alexander made him a cardinal at the tender age of 18, a purely political appointment that had nothing to do with piety. You can imagine the scene: a young, worldly prince, dressed in the scarlet robes of a cardinal, sitting in church councils, his mind not on theology but on military strategy and power politics. He was a predator forced to wear the robes of a shepherd, and he was deeply, dangerously frustrated. Next was Lucretia, the only daughter. For centuries, Lucretia Borgia would be infamous, a symbol of female depravity, accused of poisoning her enemies and sleeping with her own father and brother. But the reality you see taking shape is more tragic than monstrous. From a very young age, Lucretia was simply a pawn in her father's dynastic games. She was beautiful, intelligent, and by all accounts, a pawn with a gentle nature. But her value to her father and brother was her marriageability. She was a human chess piece to be married off to a powerful ally, then unmarried often through annulment or the convenient death of her husband and remarried to a new, more useful ally as the political winds shifted. Her life would be a series of strategic weddings and tragic widowedness, all orchestrated by the men in her family for their own gain. Finally, there was the youngest Joffa. Hes, the forgotten Borgia, the Ringo Starr of the group. He was married off at age 12 to a princess from Naples to secure a crucial southern alliance. He was given a title and a palace, but was largely kept out of the main action in Rome. He seems to have been a perfectly pleasant but unremarkable young man, and for a Borgia, being unremarkable was the safest way to be. The blatant promotion of his children was scandalous enough, but one of the strangest and most telling episodes of Alexander's early reign was his obsession with the small, but historically significant, document, the Bull of Legitimatione. Canon law was very clear that a man born of an illicit union could not hold high church office. Cesare, as the son of a cardinal, was doubly barred. This was a huge problem. So, Alexander, in his capacity as Pope, ordered the creation of a series of legal documents to solve this little inconvenience. One papal bull declared that Cesare was the legitimate son of Vano's easiest husband, a minor official. Then, a second secret bull was issued, which was a papal dispensation allowing Cesare to hold office despite his defect of birth, acknowledging that Alexander was his father. It's a fascinating piece of bureaucratic gymnastics, one document for the public, one for the secret archive, both designed by a pope to get his own son into a job he was legally forbidden from holding. Historians still debate the psychological dynamics of this family. Was Alexander's love for his children genuine, or was it purely an extension of his own ambition? The traditional narrative, fueled by their enemies, paints a picture of a decadent and corrupt family, a den of vipers. But some modern biographers have tried to offer a more nuanced view. They argue that Alexander's actions, while extreme, were operating within the established logic of the Renaissance papacy, that is, the use of family to secure power. He was just more open and more successful at it than his predecessors. Was his love for his favorite son one, a father's affection or a ruler's investment in his heir? It was likely an inseparable mix of both. As you walk through Rome, the Borgia presence is now inescapable. Their bull emblem is everywhere. The Pope's son commands the army. The Pope's other son is one of the most powerful cardinals in the Curia. The Pope's daughter is being prepared for a magnificent wedding to the lord of a powerful northern city. They are the ultimate power couple, a power quintet. The Vatican has been transformed into their family headquarters. The frustration is building. He watches his incompetent older brother being given the military glory he craves. It's a sibling rivalry that will soon have deadly consequences. While his brother Juan is busy enjoying the life of a celebrity duke in Rome, Cesare Borgia is simmering. He is a man of action trapped in the silken cage of a cardinal's robes. He attends endless church services and participates in theological debates. But his mind is elsewhere. You can see it in his dark, intense eyes. Hes studying maps of the Remagen, reading ancient military treatises, and dreaming of conquest. Becoming the figure who would inspire one of the most famous and feared books ever written, Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Cesare's chance to break free from his ecclesiastical prison comes thanks to the great political upheaval of the late 15th century, the invasion of Italy by the French. King Charles II of France marches his massive army down the peninsula to claim the throne of Naples. This event throws the entire Italian political system into chaos. Alliances shift, cities fall, and for a ruthless opportunist like Cesare, chaos is a ladder. During this period, Cesare gets his first real taste of power politics on diplomacy. He is sent as a papal legate, a hostage really, to the French king. He uses the opportunity not just to observe, but to learn. He studies the French army, its tactics, its modern artillery. He sees firsthand how a powerful, centralized monarchy can crush the bickering, disunited city-states of Italy. The lesson is clear: to survive and to conquer, You need a state that is modern, efficient, and absolutely merciless. After a series of dramatic political shifts, Cesare finally gets his wish. In a move that shocked the College of Cardinals, he becomes the first person in history to resign his cardinalate. He stands before his fellow cardinals, casts off his scarlet robes, and declares his intention to pursue a secular life. His father, Pope Alexander V, irons his request. With the full backing of the papal treasury and the diplomatic might of his father, Cesare sets out to achieve the great Borgia ambition to carve out a permanent, hereditary state for the family in the Romagnan region of central Italy. This area, technically part of the Papal States, was in reality a coherent or a patchwork of small cities, each run by a petty tyrant or a powerful family who paid lip service to the Pope but ruled as independent lords. They were known as the vicars of the Church, but they were notoriously rebellious and unreliable. Cesare's mission was to crush them all and unify the territory under his direct rule. What follows is a military campaign of breathtaking speed and brutality. Cesare is not just a warrior, he is a master of what we might now call psychological warfare. He understood that fear was a more reliable tool than love. He moved with lightning speed, using a combination of French troops, loyal Spanish mercenaries, and soldiers funded by the Vatican. He would arrive before a city's walls with his superior artillery, demand its surrender, and if the city resisted, he would sack it with terrifying efficiency. One of his most famous and chilling acts was in the city of Cesena. After conquering the city, he installed a notoriously cruel governor named Ramiro del Orca to pacify the region. Del Orca did his job with relish, using torture and execution to stamp out all dissent. Once the region was completely subdued and the people were beginning to hate Borgia rule because of Del Orca's cruelty, Cesare rode into Cesena. He wanted to win the people's goodwill. So, one morning, the townspeople woke up to a gruesome spectacle in the main piazza. Ramiro del Orca's body was laid out into pieces, with a bloody axe next to it. Cesare had had his own lieutenant executed and displayed publicly. The message was brutally clear, as Machiavelli would later analyze. The cruelty was necessary, but the blame for it has now been conveniently placed on the dead man. Cesare had both pacified the state and, in a twisted way, purged it of its evil, making himself seem like a stern but just ruler. This is the kind of cold, pragmatic cruelty that so fascinated Machiavelli, who was a Florentine diplomat at the time and had several meetings with Cesare. He saw in Cesare a new kind of prince, one who was not constrained by traditional Christian morality. Cesare understood that in the world of power, what matters is what works. He used treachery, deceit, and violence, but never randomly. It was always a calculated act, a means to an end. This is the core idea of the prince, that a ruler must be prepared to do evil things to maintain his state and achieve the greater good of stability and order. Here's a lesser-known but revealing detail about Cesare's methods. He was a pioneer of intelligence gathering. Before he attacked a city, his spies would have already infiltrated it, mapping out its defenses, identifying potential collaborators, and spreading black propaganda to demoralize the population. He was also a master of the artichoke method, stripping away a target's allies, one by one before moving in for the kill. He would sign a treaty with one lord to get his help in destroying another, only to turn on his former ally next. The debate among historians about Cesare Borgia is intense. Was he a visionary crucible of Italian chaos, or was he simply a sociopathic gangster with a genius for violence, enabled by his father's bottomless pockets? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. He was undoubtedly a brilliant military strategist and a ruthless politician. But his entire enterprise was built on a fragile foundation: the life of his father. His state had no institutional legitimacy beyond the fact that the Pope's son was in charge. All his power, all his money, and all his soldiers ultimately derived from Alexander VI. Machiavelli himself noted this as Cesare's one great failing: he did not, or could not, control the next papal election. As you watch Cesare's meteoric rise, conquering city after city, you see the birth of a legend. He is feared, he is hated, but he is also grudgingly admired for his sheer effectiveness. He is the prince, the new model of ruler for a new, more cynical age. But his sister Lucretia is playing a very different, and far more difficult, game back in Rome. While Cesare is out on the battlefield, making a name for himself with fire and sword, his sister Lucretia is navigating a very different kind of wars in the world of dynastic marriage. Her story is one of the most tragic and misunderstood of the Renaissance. For centuries, her name has been synonymous with poison, incest, and betrayal. She is the archetypal femme fatale. But as you look closer at her life, a different picture emerges. You see a young woman, intelligent and cultured, whose life is completely dictated by the political ambitions of her father and brother. Lucretia Borgia was, by all accounts, a golden girl. She had long blonde hair, a graceful demeanor, and a solid education in music, poetry, and several languages. In another life, she might have been a celebrated patron of the arts or a beloved duchess. In the Borgia family, however, her beauty and her bloodline were simply assets to be leveraged. She was a piece of high-value currency in the family's political bank. Her first major role was as the bride-to-be of Giovanni Sforza, the ruler of the small but strategically important city of Pesaro. The marriage was a spectacular affair, a grand public statement of the alliance between the Borgias and the powerful Sforza clan of Milan. Lucretia was just 13 years old. The wedding was meant to solidify her father's power in the early days of his papacy. But in the fast-moving world of Italian politics, alliances were as stable as houses built on sand. A few years later, the political winds shifted. The Sforzas were no longer useful to the Borgias. In fact, they had become political liabilities. Alexander VI needed a new alliance with Naples, his enemy's enemy. Suddenly, Lucretia's husband, Giovanni Sforza, was a problem that needed to be solved. Cesare would have solved it with a knife in a dark alley. Alexander, however, chose a more bureaucratic, and in some ways more humiliating method. The official grounds were embarrassing and deeply personal. The Pope's commission declared that Giovanni Sforza was impotent and had therefore never consummated the marriage. It was a legal fiction, a public shaming designed to discard a now useless son-in-law, claiming he had consummated the marriage many times. But you can't win a legal battle against the Pope, who is also the supreme judge. Eventually, fearing for his life, Giovanni signed the papers, but not before getting his revenge. It was he who started the most vicious and damaging rumor about the Borgias that the only reason Alexander wanted the marriage annulled was so that he could have Lucretia for himself. This was the seed of the incest rumor that would haunt the Borgia name forever. Freed from her first husband, the 17-year-old Lucretia was immediately repurposed for the family's next political project. She was married to Alfonso of Aragon, the handsome young Duke of Bisceglie. He was the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This was a brilliant match, cementing the new Borgia alliance with the South. And by all accounts, this was a genuine love match. Lucretia and Alfonso were devoted to each other. They had a son together, and she seemed content. But again the political winds shifted. Cesare, now in the midst of his campaigns in the Remagen, needed the support of France. The problem was that France and Naples were bitter enemies. Lucretia's beloved husband, a Neapolitan prince, had suddenly become a symbol of a failed political alliance. He was an obstacle to Cesare's ambitions. And Cesare Borgia had a very direct way of dealing with obstacles. One night, as Alfonso of Aragon was walking home near the Vatican, he was attacked by a group of assassins and stabbed multiple times. He was gravely wounded but managed to survive, carried into the Vatican and tended by Lucretia herself. She was terrified, refusing to leave his side, tasting all his food for fear of poison. But she couldn't protect him. A few weeks later, Cesare reportedly lost his patience. He visited the sick room, and according to one account, leaned in and whispered to Lucretia, "What is not accomplished at noon can be done at night." Later that day, Cesare's most loyal and feared henchman, a man named Michel Otto Carella, entered the room, cleared everyone out, and strangled the young duke in his bed. This is the central controversy of Lucretia's life, the one that historians still passionately debate. Was she a willing participant in her family's crimes, or was she a helpless victim? Watching in horror as the man she loved was murdered on the orders of her own brother, the traditional black legend of the Borgias casts her as a cold-hearted accomplice. But a more modern, sympathetic reading of the evidence suggests she was devastated and powerless. After Alfonso's murder, she was sent away from Rome to grieve, clearly distraught. Her direct involvement in any of the Borgias' violent schemes is supported by virtually no credible evidence. The stories of her possessing a hollow ring filled with poison, the Cantarella of the Borgias, are almost certainly lurid fictions created by her family's enemies. Her final marriage was her most successful. This time she was married off to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The Este family was one of the oldest and most respected noble houses in Italy, and they were initially horrified at the prospect of marrying their heir to the scandalous daughter of the Pope. It took a massive dowry and immense papal pressure to make the match happen. But once in Ferrara, away from the toxic politics of Rome and the suffocating influence of her family, Lucretia blossomed. She created a brilliant Renaissance court, patronized artists and poets, and became known as a pious and effective ruler. She finally escaped the Borgia curse and built a life of her own, earning the respect and love of her subjects. Her story is a powerful reminder of how history is often written by the victors or, in this case, by the enemies of the vanquished. But back in Rome, with Alfonso of Aragon out of the way, the Borgias are at the absolute peak of their power. The parties they throw in the Vatican have become legendary, not for their piety, but for their depravity. With Cesare conquering the Romagna and Lucretia's marital allegiances secured, the Borgia family is riding high. The Vatican is no longer just the administrative center of the Christian world, it's their personal fortress, their corporate headquarters, and most notoriously, their private party palace. The stories that leak out from behind the Apostolic Palace's walls become the scandal of Europe, cementing the Borgia reputation for decadence and debauchery. You're a guest or perhaps a servant, it's safer that way at one of Pope Alexander V's infamous gatherings. The setting itself is a study in contradiction. You're in the heart of the Vatican, surrounded by sacred art and religious iconography. But the atmosphere is anything but holy. The Pope of spectacle, and his parties are lavish, multi-day affairs. The finest foods from all over the known world are served on golden plates. The rarest wines flow like water. Musicians play captivating melodies while poets recite flattering verses. But it's not the food or the music that people are whispering about all over Europe. It's the entertainment. Alexander VI, the Vicar of Christ, has a fundus full theatrical performances that are, to put it mildly, not family-friendly. Dancers, courtesans, and actors stage plays and ballets that are often bawdy and explicit. The Pope, along with his children and his cardinals, would watch with delight. It's the ultimate display of their power. They are so secure, so untouchable, that they can openly flout the very moral rules they are supposed to enforce upon the rest of the world. The most infamous of all these events is the one that has gone down in history as the Banquet of the Chestnuts. Your main source for this story is the diary of the papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, a man who seemed to have a front row seat to every Borgia scandal and documented it with a kind of horrified, meticulous precision. According to Burchard, on the evening of October 30, 1501, Cesare Borgia hosted a dinner party in his apartments in the Vatican. The Pope, Lucretia, and numerous cardinals were in attendance. After the meal, the tables were cleared, and chandeliers holding lit candles were placed on the floor. A large number of chestnuts were scattered among the candles. Then, according to Burchard's diary, 50 courtesans or prostitutes were brought into the hall. They were invited to strip naked and crawl on their hands and knees among the candles, picking up the chestnuts. The Pope and his guests watched from their seats. Burchard then goes on to describe even more depraved contests for which prizes were awarded. It's an image so shocking, so utterly profane, the head of the church presiding over an orgy in the heart of the Vatican, that it has come to define the Borgia papacy. It's the ultimate symbol of their corruption. Now this is where history gets tricky and where historians love to argue. Did the Banquet of the Chestnuts actually happen as Burchard described it? For centuries, it was accepted as fact, a key piece of evidence for the Borgia's monstrous nature. But in more recent times, scholars have started to question it. The argument against it goes like this: Burchard is the only source who describes this event. No other diplomat, cardinal, or chronicler in Rome at the time mentions it, which is strange for an event so scandalous. Furthermore, Bashar was known to be deeply hostile to the Borgias. His diary is full of negative stories about them. Is it possible he exaggerated the story, or even invented it? As a piece of anti-Borgia propaganda, some historians argue that the story is just lurid to be true, a fabrication designed to make the Borgias look as evil as possible. The argument for its authenticity rests on Bashar's reputation as a stickler for detail. He was a master of ceremonies. His job was to record what happened. His diary is generally considered a reliable, if biased, source for the day-to-day life of the papal court. Proponents argue that the lack of other sources could be because no one else dared to write down such a scandalous account, or perhaps their accounts were simply lost to time. The debate is a perfect example of how difficult it is to get to the truth of history when your sources are few and deeply biased. Was it real? Was it an exaggeration? Was it a complete fabrication? We will likely never know for sure. True or not, the reputation of these parties was a powerful weapon in the hands of the Borgias' enemies. And they had many. While the Pope was enjoying his parties, a storm was gathering. One man, in particular, watched the rise of the Borgias with a cold, burning hatred. He was a rival cardinal, a fellow political heavyweight, and he had been nursing a grudge since the day he lost the papal election to Rodrigo Borgia's silver mules. His name was Julius della Rovere, and he would become the Borgias' most relentless and dangerous foe. He was a man who knew how to wait, and he was convinced that the Borgias' decadent reign was an insult to God and the Church and, perhaps more importantly, an obstacle to his own ambition. He fled Rome, fearing for his life, and began plotting his revenge from exile. The party in the Vatican was about to come to a screeching halt. While the Borgia family consolidates its power with military campaigns and lavish parties, their greatest enemy is biding his time. This isn't a foreign king or a rebellious baron. He is an insider, a man who knows the treacherous corridors of the Vatican as well as they do. His name is Julius della Rovere, and he is the nemesis of the Borgia clan. Their rivalry is the central political drama of this papacy, a personal feud that shapes the destiny of Italy. To understand della Rovere, you have to understand his background. Like the Borgias, he was a product of nepotism. His uncle was Pope Sixtus IV, who made him a cardinal at a young age. But unlike the Borgias, he was Italian, from a powerful family that saw the papacy as their birthright. He was a man of fierce ambition, boundless energy, and a terrifyingly short temper. The Romans had a nickname for him, Il Terrible, the Terrible One. It wasn't just because of his fearsome demeanor, it was a term of respect for his formidable, awe-inspiring nature. He was a force of nature, a man who did not bend. He was the leading candidate to become pope in the 1490 conclave, the one who was outmaneuvered and outbid by Rodrigo Borgia's silver. It was a humiliation he never forgot and never forgave. From the moment Alexander VI was elected, della Rovere knew he was a marked man. In the world of Renaissance Rome, a defeated rival was a threat to be eliminated. He correctly assumed that the Borgias would eventually try to get rid of him with a dagger, or more likely, with a dose of poison. So he did the smart thing, he fled. He escaped to France and became a central figure at the court of King Charles VII. There he transformed from a Roman cardinal into a political exile, a constant thorn in Alexander VI's side. His one great project was to depose Alexander. He relentlessly lobbied the French king and other European monarchs, urging them to call a church council to investigate the Pope. His main accusation was that Alexander had won the papacy through simony, the sin of buying church office, and was therefore an inner pope who should be removed. This was a brilliant political move. It took his personal vendetta and cloaked it in the language of righteous church reform. He presented himself not as a sore loser, but as a defender of the faith, trying to purge the church of a corrupt usurper. This constant threat of a council was Alexander's greatest diplomatic headache. It forced him into a series of frantic political maneuvers to keep the kings of Europe on his side and prevent them from listening to his charismatic and persuasive rival. The rivalry between Borgia and della Rovere was fought with all the weapons of the era: armies, diplomacy, propaganda, and, of course, assassination plots. Both men had networks of spies, constantly feeding them information about the other's plans. Alexander tried to lure della Rovere back to Rome with promises of safety, But Della Rover was too smart to fall into that trap. He knew that an invitation to the Vatican from a Borgia was a death sentence. Here we find a quirky little detail that highlights the paranoia of the age: the use of food tasters. For a man like Alexander Vere, or his enemy Della Rover, sitting down to a meal was a high-risk activity. Poison was the preferred method of quiet assassination, so no powerful figure would eat without his crade's nairi or taster, first sampling the dish. This was a position of immense trust. The taster had to be incorporated, because a bribe to the taster was a direct route to his master's stomach. This constant, daily fear of being poisoned was simply part of the job description for a Renaissance prince or pope. The historical debates surrounding Giuliano Della Rover is fascinating. Was he truly the righteous reformer he claimed to be, a man genuinely scandalized by the Borgias' corruption, or was he a cynical hypocrite, using the language of reform to mask his own frustrated ambition? His later career certainly complicates the heroic narrative. When he eventually did become Pope Julius II, he was hardly a pious shepherd. He was a warrior pious shepherd, leading armies to expand the papal states in many ways, continuing the same centralizing project that Cesare Borgia had started. He was also a master of nepotism, just like his predecessors. This suggests that the core of his hatred for Alexander I was not just about morality, it was about legitimacy and style. In Della Rover's eyes, the Borgias were fun upstarts who had stolen what was rightfully his. Their flamboyant, public decadence was an insult to the dignity of the papal office. Della Rover's own sins, his temper, his wars, his only legitimate children were, in his mind, the traditional sins of a proper Italian prince-pope. The Borgias' sins were something different, something alien and to him, far more offensive. For a decade, this Cold War simmered. Della Rover remained in exile, a shadow hanging over the Borgia court, waiting for his opportunity. The Borgias, for their part, were constantly looking over their shoulders, wary of the plots being hatched by their great rival. Their power in Rome seemed absolute, but they knew it was built on a fragile foundation. They had dealt with the rebellious barons and the treacherous Italian lords. They had used marriage and military might to secure their dynasty. But to make their power permanent, they had to eliminate all their rivals. And for that, according to their enemies, they had a special secret weapon, a family recipe for getting rid of inconvenient people. As you navigate the treacherous social landscape of Borgia Rome, you learn to be very, very careful about what you eat and drink, especially at parties hosted by people in power. The fear of poison hangs in the air like the city's humidity. While the dagger in the dark alley is a common tool, poison is seen as more elegant, more discreet. It's the weapon of choice for the sophisticated schemer, and no family is more associated with the dark art of poison than the Borgias. Their name became so linked with it that the whisper of a single word could send a chill down a cardinal's spine. Cantarella. Cantarella was, according to legend, the Borgias' secret family poison. It was said to be a white powder, derived from arsenic, with a sweetish taste that could be easily mixed into wine or food without the victim noticing. The stories claim it was a slow-acting poison, one that mimicked the symptoms of a natural illness like stomach fever, allowing the target to decline and die over a period of weeks or months. This gave the Borgias plausible deniability. Cardinal so-and-so has succumbed to a terrible ague. Meanwhile, they had already planned who would take over his wealthy resort. The legend of Cantarella is a key part of the Borgia Black Legend, a collection of horror stories circulated by their enemies to paint them as monstrous villains. The tales are incredibly specific and cinematic. Lucretia supposedly had a hollow ring she could use to discreetly drop the poison into a guest's wine glass. Cesare, it was said, had a more direct method, sometimes joining the target for a friendly drink, his cup filled with harmless wine, while the victim's cup was laced with the deadly powder. The most famous story involved Pope Alexander VI himself. The plan was to invite wealthy cardinals to a lavish banquet, serve them poisoned wine, and then seize their fortunes upon their deaths to fund Cesare's campaigns. It's a terrifying, uncompelling narrative. It cemented the Borgias in the popular imagination as the original crime family, using secret potions to eliminate their rivals with cold, scientific precision. But here's where you have to put on your historian's hat and ask a critical question: how much of this is actually the historical evidence for the Borgias' use of a specific secret poison like cantarella is surprisingly thin. It relies almost entirely on the accounts of their political enemies and on gossip recorded by chroniclers, who were often repeating third-hand rumors. Let's look at the science, or rather, the lack of it. Cantarella was likely just a name given to arsenic, which was a well-known poison at the time. The idea of a tasteless, odorless powder is a bit of a myth. Arsenic compounds often had a noticeable metallic taste. Furthermore, forensic science didn't exist. When a wealthy, powerful person died suddenly, especially if their death was convenient for someone else, the default assumption was often poison, even if the cause was often poison, even if the cause was a heart attack, a stroke, or a rampant disease like malaria, which was endemic in Rome. This brings us to a fascinating little detail about Renaissance medicine. The line between a poison and a medicine was dangerously blurry. Arsenic, the supposed main ingredient of cantarella, was actually used in small doses by physicians to treat a variety of ailments, including syphilis, and the very substance rumored to be the Borgias' murder weapon was also sitting on the shelf of many a respectable doctor. So did the Borgias poison people? The answer is almost certainly yes. Assassination was a standard political tool in Renaissance Italy, and poison was one of its primary instruments. It would be more surprising if they hadn't used it. When a wealthy old cardinal died and the Borgias immediately seized his assets, it's reasonable to be suspicious. However, the idea that they were uniquely skilled poisoners with a secret family recipe is where history bleeds into myth. The debate among historians today is not about whether the Borgias killed people, but about the scale and methodology of their killing. Were they systematic poisoners, hosting death banquets as a matter of policy, or were they just as ruthless as any other Italian prince of their day, with their use of poison being wildly exaggerated by their enemies? Most modern historians lean toward the latter. They argue that the Black Legend took the reality of Borgia ruthlessness and amplified it into a Gothic horror story. The cantarella myth was a powerful piece of propaganda because it played on common fears and made the Borgias seem not just politically corrupt, but supernaturally evil. It transformed them from mere thugs into diabolical masterminds. The power of this legend was immense. It created a climate of terror around the family. Cardinals would fall ill and immediately suspect the Pope's hand. The fear itself became a weapon. Alexander and Cesare didn't necessarily have to poison everyone, they just needed everyone to believe they were capable of it. The paranoia did half the work for them. While the Borgias were busy consolidating their power in Rome through these alleged, shadowy means, a very different kind of challenge was brewing. It wasn't a secret plot hatched in a dark corridor. It was a public and fiery denunciation coming from a man who feared no one, not even the Pope himself. In the city of Florence, a charismatic friar was preaching sermons of fire and brimstone, openly calling the Borgia Pope the Antichrist, and he was about to learn what happened when you publicly challenged the most powerful family in Italy. While the Roman elite are whispering about poison and palace orgies, a different kind of drama is unfolding a few hundred miles north in the city of Florence. Here, the challenge to Pope Alexander V isn't coming from a rival cardinal or a French king, but from a thin, intense Dominican friar with burning eyes and a voice that could shake the soul. His name is Girolamo Savonarola, and he represents a threat the Borgias are uniquely ill-equipped to handle, a genuinely popular movement of moral and religious reform. You find yourself in the vast Cathedral of Florence, the Duomo, packed to the rafters with thousands of people. The air is electric. They're all here to listen to Savonarola. H.E.S. not a gentle preacher talking about love and forgiveness. He is a prophet of the Old Testament, a thunderous voice calling for repentance. From his pulpit, he launches into a searing sermon. He attacks the vanity and decadence of Florence, a city that prides itself on its art, its fashion, and its humanist learning. He calls the magnificent paintings and sculptures idols, the philosophical texts vanities. But his most venomous attacks are reserved for the church itself, and specifically for the man who leads it. He doesn't just criticize the Pope, he declares that the Borgia papacy is a monstrous corruption, a cancer on the body of Christ. He calls Alexander V. Simon IAC, a heretic and a servant of Satan. He tells the Florentine people that the church is no longer in Rome, that the true spirit of God has fled the debauched Vatican and now resides here, in Florence. He preaches that Alexander is not a true pope and that his excommunications have no spiritual weight. This is not a backroom conspiracy, it's a direct, public, and hugely popular challenge to the Pope's spiritual authority. And for a while, Savonarola is unstoppable. After the powerful Medici family is exiled from Florence, Savonarola becomes the city's de facto leader. He helps establish a new Florentine republic, a kind of Christian theocracy with Jesus Christ officially declared the King of Florence. He uses his influence to enforce a strict moral code. Nicknamed the Piagnani or Weepers for their public displays of penitence, form gangs of holy police. These groups of boys and young men roam the city, encouraging people to dress modestly and give up their worldly pleasures. This moral fervor culminates in one of the most famous and bizarre events of the Renaissance, the bonfire of the vanities. Savonarola instructs the people of Florence to bring their vanities, their mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothes, musical instruments, and immoral books and paintings to the city's main square, the Piazza della Signoria. There these worldly treasures are thrown onto a gigantic pyramid-shaped pyre and set ablaze. It is a powerful symbol of the city's rejection of Renaissance hedonism and its embrace of Savonarola's austere vision of Christianity. Here's a small debated detail about this event. Tradition holds that the great Florentine artist Andrea Botticelli, famous for his sensuous and mythological paintings like The Birth of Venus, became a follower of Savonarola unwillingly threw some of his own pagan-themed canvases onto the fire. It's a dramatic story of an artist renouncing his own beautiful creations. Historians still argue about this. Did Botticelli really burn his own paintings? The evidence is circumstantial. His later works do show a marked shift toward a more somber, intensely religious style which suggests Savonarola had a profound influence on him. But the image of him actively destroying his masterpieces might be a romantic exaggeration. Back in Rome, Alexander VI is watching this situation with growing fury. At first, he tried to silence Savonarola with flattery, offering to make him a cardinal. Savonarola famously retorted from his pulpit that the only reed hat he would accept was one reed with his own blood, a hat of martyrdom. As Savonarola's attacks grew more direct and his influence more threatening, Alexander's patience ran out. But Savonarola simply defied him. He declared the excommunication invalid because it came from a corrupt pope and continued to preach, drawing even larger crowds. This put the city of Florence in an impossible position. By harboring an excommunicated friar, they were risking a papal interdict, which would cripple their economy by banning trade with other Christian states. The debate among historians is over Alexander's motivations. Was he genuinely offended by Savonarola's insubordination and heresy, seeing him as a threat to the unity of the Church, or was his opposition purely political? Savonarola's Florence was allied with France, the Borgias' main rival at the time. Getting rid of Savonarola was a way to break the Franco-Florentine alliance and bring the powerful city back into the papal fold. As with most things in this era, the motives were likely a tangled mess of the political and the pious. Ultimately, Savonarola's downfall came not from the Pope, but from his own people. The Florentines began to tire of his strict moral regime. The economy was suffering under the threat of the interdict. His enemies within the city grew bolder. The final straw was a proposed trial by fire, where one of Savonarola's followers, and a rival Franciscan friar, would walk through flames to prove whose side God was on. The spectacle turned into a farce when they argued for hours over procedural details, and a sudden rainstorm extinguished the fire. The crowd, feeling cheated out of a miracle, turned on Savonarola. He was arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to being a false prophet. In May 1498, Girolamo Savonarola and two of his leading followers were hanged in the same piazza as where they had held their bonfire of the vanities. Their bodies were then burned to ensure no relics could be collected by his followers. The Borgias had won. They had silenced the fiery friar. But even as they dealt with this public challenge, a much more intimate and far more mysterious crisis was about to strike at the very heart of the Borgia family itself. The year is 1497. The Borgia family is at the zenith of its power. Cesare is a cardinal, already dreaming of armies. Lucretia is navigating her first strategic marriage, and the Pope's favorite son, Juan, Duke of Gandia, is the commander of the papal forces. He is the handsome, celebrated face of the Borgia dynasty. The story begins on the evening of June 14th. The Pope's mistress, Van O's Eadi Catanei, is hosting a dinner party at her vineyard on the Esquiline Hill. It's a family affair. Pope Alexander is not present, but several of his children are, including Cesare, dressed in his cardinal's robes, and Juan, the guest of honor. The atmosphere is convivial. The wine flows. They eat, they talk, they laugh. Late in the evening, Juan and Cesare decide to ride back towards the Vatican. They are accompanied by a small group of attendants. At some point during the ride, near the palace of the Sforza family, Juan tells Cesare he has some private business to attend to. He dismisses his attendants, keeping only one trusted footman and a mysterious man in a mask who had been seen with him earlier in the day. Juan then rides off into the dark, narrow streets of Rome. He was never seen alive again. The next morning, when Juan hasn't returned to his apartments in the Vatican, there is little concern. He was a notorious womanizer and was known for his late-night escapades. The Pope himself probably assumes his favorite son is simply sleeping off a hangover in some hidden boudoir. But as the day wears on and there is still no sign of him, a slow, dawning panic begins to set in. The Pope, a man who commanded kings and armies, is frantic. He orders a massive search of the city. Every back alley is to be scoured. The city is turned upside down. Finally, a witness comes forward. A timber merchant who lived near the Tiber River claimed that, on the night of the murder, he had been guarding his woodpile. Around midnight, he saw two men emerge from a dark lane. Then two more men appeared carrying a body. A fifth man on a white horse, a wealthy-looking gentleman, supervised the operation. The men swung the body back and forth and then hewed it into the river. The witness was asked why he did into the river. His answer is one of the most famous and revealing quotes of the era. He said he had seen 100 bodies thrown into the river at that point on different nights, and had never seen any notice taken of it. It's a chilling snapshot of the casual violence of life in Renaissance Rome. Based on this testimony, the Pope orders the river to be dragged. Before long, the searchers find him. The body of Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, is pulled from the muddy waters of the Tiber. He is still fully dressed in his expensive clothes. His purse, still containing gold coins, isn't touched. This was not a robbery. This was an assassination. An examination of the body revealed he had been stabbed 9 times. The Pope's grief was absolute and terrifying to behold. He locked himself in his chambers, his anguished cries echoing through the halls of the Vatican. For days he refused to eat or speak to anyone. When he finally emerged, he was a broken man. He appeared before his cardinals, weeping, and declared that this was a divine punishment for his sins. He vowed to reform the church, to give up his mistresses, to end the corruption. It was a moment of genuine, profound despair. But who did it? This is one of the great unsolved murder mysteries of the Renaissance, a historical whodunit that has fascinated historians for 5 centuries. The list of suspects is long, and nearly everyone on it had a good reason to want Juan Borgia dead. Suspicion first fell on the great Roman families, the enemies of the Borgias. The Orsini clan, in particular, had recently been defeated in battle by Juan's papal army. Had they sought revenge, or was it the Sforza family? Lucretia's discarded husband, Giovanni Sforza, certainly had a motive for revenge after his public humiliation. He had been threatened by Juan and had fled Rome in fear of his life just a few weeks earlier. But as the investigation, or lack thereof, progressed, a darker, more disturbing suspect emerged from within the Borgia family itself. The whispers started quietly at first, then grew louder. The prime suspect, in the minds of many Romans, was Juan's own brother, Cardinal Cesare Borgia. The motive was clear: sibling rivalry and ambition. Cesare, the brilliant and ruthless strategist, was stuck in his cardinal's robes while his incompetent but favored older brother was given the military command and the secular titles that Cesare craved. Juan was the only thing standing between Cesare and his destiny. With Juan gone, Cesare would become the sole focus of his father's dynastic ambitions. The masked man seen with Juan on the night of his disappearance, some said it was a decoy, or even Cesare himself in disguise. This theory is central to the debate about Cesare's character. Was he capable of murdering his own brother in cold blood for political gain? His later actions in the Romagans certainly suggest he had the necessary ruthlessness. However, there is no direct evidence linking him to the crime. No confession, no smoking gun. The proof is entirely circumstantial, based on motive and character. Some historians are convinced he did it, seeing it as the ultimate act of Machiavellian pragmatism. Others argue that it's just as likely that one of the Borgias' many other enemies was responsible, and that the Cesare did it theory was a convenient piece of propaganda spread by his rivals. And then there's the oddest, most tragic detail of all. After a few weeks of intense, public grief and promises of reform, the official investigation into the murder was quietly shut down. The Pope never spoke of it again. The promised reforms were forgotten. It was as if a curtain had been drawn over the entire affair. Why did Alexander discover the truth and find it so monstrous that one of his sons had killed the other that he couldn't bear to face it? Or did he simply realize that a prolonged investigation would reveal too many of the family's other dark secrets we will never know? The murder of Juan Borgia remains a cold case, a dark secret at the heart of the family, and a turning point in their story. From the ashes of his brother's death, Cesare Borgia was about to rise. The murder of Juan Borgia is a pivotal moment. The Pope's initial, soul-shattering grief soon gives way to a cold, pragmatic realization. His favorite son, his dream of a dynasty built on Juan's charm and title, is dead in the waters of the Tiber. But he has another son, a more dangerous son, a more capable son. All the ambition, all the resources, all the papal power that had been focused on Juan now shifts to Cesare. And the business of the Borgias is about to get a lot more brutal. With Juan gone, Cesare finally gets everything he ever wanted. He resigns from his cardinalate, becoming the first person in history to do so. He casts off the red robes he so despised and dons the armor of a soldier. His father, Pope Alexander VI, channels the full power of the papacy into backing Cesare's ambitions. The papal treasury becomes Cesare's personal war chest. Papal diplomacy becomes his tool for forging alliances. The spiritual authority of the Pope is used to declare Cesare's enemies as rebels against the Church, making their destruction a holy act. This is the period of Cesare's greatest triumphs, the whirlwind campaign across the Romagan where he builds his state through terror and brilliance. He is no longer just the Pope's son, he is Duke of Valentino, is a French title given to him by the King of France, Duke of Romagan, and the most feared man in Italy. The Borgia enterprise has become a tune Operation Alexander, the political mastermind and money man in Rome, and Cesare, the military enforcer in the field. They seem to be on the verge of achieving their ultimate goal, creating a permanent, hereditary Borgia kingdom in the heart of Italy. They have crushed the rebellious barons, neutralized their political rivals, and accumulated immense wealth by seizing the property of the cardinals and nobles they have eliminated. Their power seems absolute, unshakable. But it's all built on a fatal weakness, a single point of failure, the life of one 72-year-old man, Pope Alexander VI. The end comes with shocking suddenness, not with a bang but with a fever. In the sweltering heat of August 1503, both Pope Alexander and his son Cesare attended dinner party hosted by Cardinal Adriano Castelci. It was a small, outdoor gathering at the Cardinal's villa, a pleasant escape from the city's summer stench. A few days after the dinner, a terrifying rumor sweeps through Rome. The Pope and his son are gravely ill. Immediately, the city buzzes with the obvious suspicion poison. But the story has a twist of black comic irony. The rumor isn't just that they were poisoned themselves. The story, spread gleefully by their enemies, goes like this: Alexander and Cesare had intended to poison their host, the wealthy Cardinal Castelci, in order to seize his fortune. They brought a cask of poisoned wine with them. But a servant, unaware of the plot, accidentally served the poisoned wine to the Pope and his son instead. It's a perfect morality tale the master poisoner arrests, undone by their own wicked device. This story of the bungle poisoning is one of the most famous tales about the Borgias. It has been repeated in books and movies for centuries. It's a wonderfully neat and ironic ending to their story. The only problem is, it's almost certainly not true. Modern historians and medical experts have almost universally rejected the poison theory. The symptoms described by eyewitnesses, fever, vomiting, chills, are perfectly consistent with the most lethal killer in Renaissance Rome, malaria. The city, especially in the late summer, was a breeding ground for mosquitoes carrying the deadly disease. The low-lying areas around the particularly swampy and dangerous. The fact that all three men who attended the dinner, Alexander, Cesare, and the host Cardinal Castel C, fell ill with similar symptoms points not to a selective poison, but to a shared environmental exposure. They were all likely bitten by the same infected mosquitoes. Here's a small, gruesome detail about the Pope's death that fueled the poison rumors. The summer heat was so intense that the Pope's body decomposed with shocking speed. Johann Bouchard, the ever-present master of ceremonies, describes a horrific scene in his diary. The Pope's body swelled, turned black, and became so bloated as couldn't fit it into the coffin. They had to use force pushing and pounding the corpse until it ruptured. To the superstitious populace of Rome, this grotesque decomposition was seen as a sign of divine judgment, proof that the Pope had been a servant of the devil and was being claimed by his master. For a modern historian, it's simply a tragic but understandable consequence of a body with a high fever decomposing rapidly in the August heat. The debate over the cause of death, poison or malaria, is a classic example of history versus legend. The legend is a better story, more ironic and more fitting for the Borgias' reputation, but the historical evidence points overwhelmingly to the more mundane and far more common killer. Cesare, younger and stronger, survives the illness, but just barely. He is delirious with fever, his body racked with pain. At the exact moment, he needs his full strength and wits. As his father lies dead, Cesare is incapacitated, unable to control the political chaos that erupts immediately. The entire Borgia enterprise, built on the twin pillars of his father's authority and his own military might, collapses overnight. Their enemies, led by the vengeful Giuliano della Rovere, come swarming back to Rome. The families the Borgias had dispossessed rise up to reclaim their lands. Cesare's army, deprived of its papal funding, deserts him. In a matter of weeks, Cesare Borgia goes from being the most feared man in Italy to a powerless fugitive. His state crumbles. His fortune is seized. He is arrested, imprisoned, and eventually escapes to live out his last few years as a common mercenary, a ghost of his former self. He is killed in a minor, meaningless skirmish in Spain a few years later. The great Borgia dream is over. The dynasty that was meant to rule for a century had lasted barely a decade. Their fall was as swift and dramatic as their rise, and waiting in the wings to pick up the pieces is their old nemesis, a man who knows exactly what to do with the power they left behind. With the Borgias swept from the board, the game of papal politics is wide open again. The man who steps into the vacuum is their old, implacable enemy, Giuliano della Rovere. After a decade in exile, plotting his revenge, his moment has finally arrived. Following a brief, month-long papacy of an elderly compromised candidate, della Rovere maneuvers his way onto the throne of Street Peter with breathtaking speed and efficiency. And if the people of Rome thought the era of the scandalous, power-hungry Pope was over, they were about to be very surprised. Julius II was nothing like his Borgia predecessor in personality. Where Alexander VI was charming, decadent, and subtle, Julius was brusque, energetic, and had the temperament of a cannon. He was known for his explosive outbursts of temper, but in their ambition to wield secular power, they were two sides of the same coin. Julius looked at what Cesare Borgia had accomplished, the unification of the papal states, and thought, good idea, but it should be mine. His entire papacy would be dedicated to one goal: restoring and expanding the temporal power of the Church, with himself as its undisputed warrior king. You are now in a Rome that feels different. The decadent, Spanish-infused parties of the Borgias are gone. In their place is the relentless, percussive energy of a man on a mission. Julius II had no time for the subtle poisons and back alley intrigues of his predecessors. His methods were much more direct. He preferred cannons and cavalry charges. He wasn't just a pope who waged war, he was a pope who led the war. One of the most enduring images of Julius II is of him as an old man, well into his 60s, clad in silver armor, riding at the head of his troops through a blizzard to lay siege to a rebellious city. He would stand in the freezing trenches with his soldiers, directing cannon fire and shouting encouragement. He scaled siege ladders to be the first man over the wall. This was not a spiritual shepherd, this was a general, a condottiere hero in papal robes. His nickname, Il Terrible, now took on a new, more martial meaning. He was the fearsome pope, a man whose divine and military fury were one and the same. His great project was to reclaim the cities of the Remagen that had been seized by Cesare Borgia and had since fallen into the hands of the Venetians. Venice, the wealthy and powerful maritime republic, was his great rival. To fight them, he performed a stunning act of diplomatic jiu-jitsu. He formed the League of Cambrai, an alliance of all the major powers of Europe, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, all united for the sole purpose of crushing Venice. It was a diplomatic peace, and it worked. The Venetian army was shattered, and the Pope reclaimed his lost territories. Of course, as soon as Venice was defeated, the League fell apart, and Julius, in another stunning reversal, turned on his former French allies, whom he now saw as the greatest threat to Italian independence. He formed a new Holy League to drive the French barbarians out of Italy. His famous battle cry was Fuori Barbari, out with the barbarians. It's a slogan that would be resonate in Italian politics for centuries. This brings up a fascinating debate among historians. Was Julius II the first Italian nationalist, a patriot trying to free Italy from foreign domination, or was he just another power-hungry pope, cynically using the language of patriotism to advance his own territorial ambitions? The truth is complex. He certainly saw himself as the champion of Italian liberty against foreign powers. But his Italy was one in which the Pope was the dominant political force. His patriotism was inseparable from his ambition for the papacy. He wasn't fighting for a unified Italian nation in the modern sense, he was fighting for a unified papal state that could dominate the peninsula. And here's a quirky detail that perfectly captures his personality. Julius II was the first pope to grow a beard since antiquity. In an era when clergy were expected to be clean-shaven, this was a shocking statement. He initially grew it as a sign of mourning after a military defeat, vowing not to shave it until he had driven the French from Italy, but it also served a political purpose. The beard made him look like the powerful patriarchs and prophets of the Old Testament, or like the great emperors of ancient Rome. It was a piece of personal branding, projecting an image of fierce, masculine, and venerable power. It was a visual rejection of the smooth-faced, decadent style of the Borgias. He was a man of action and impatience, and this extended to his other great passion, art. Julius II wasn't just a warrior, he was one of the greatest and most demanding art patrons in history. He didn't see art as a pleasant diversion. He saw it as a tool of power, a way to glorify God, the papacy, and of course himself. He decided that the old street, Peter's Basilica, a 1,000-year-old church, wasn't grand enough. He ordered it to be torn down and a new one built in its place, the magnificent basilica that stands today. He commissioned Raphael to paint the stunning frescoes in his private apartments in the Vatican. And most famously, he entered into a tumultuous, epic relationship with the most brilliant and temperamental artist of the age, Michelangelo. The story of the warrior pope and the genius sculptor is a clash of two titanic egos, a battle of wills that would produce some of the most sublime art the world has ever seen. The Pope wanted a tomb for himself, a monument so grand it would dwarf the tombs of the Roman emperors. But first, he had another little project in mind for the reluctant artist. He wanted him to paint a ceiling. The relationship between Pope Julius II and Michelangelo Buonarroti is one of the great epics of art history. It's a story about a terrifyingly impatient patron and a famously stubborn artist, a clash of two colossal egos that resulted in the creation of a masterpiece that neither of them originally wanted. You're no longer on the battlefield, you're on the scaffold, 60 feet in the air, with the smell of wet plaster in your nostrils and the constant, booming voice of the Pope echoing from below. Michelangelo was a sculptor. He saw himself as a sculptor and nothing else. To him, painting was a lesser, messier art form. His life's ambition was to carve monumental figures from marble, to release the forms he saw trapped within the stone. When Julius II first summoned him to Rome, it was for a sculptor's dream project, the Pope's own tomb. It was to be a massive, three-story freestanding monument decorated with over 40 life-sized statues. It was a project of such immense scale that it would have been the greatest work of sculpture since antiquity. Michelangelo was ecstatic. He spent months in the quarries of Carrara, personally selecting the perfect blocks of marble. But then, Julius II, ever impetuous, changed his mind. His attention shifted to his other grand projects, the war against Venice and the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. The tomb project was put on hold. Michelangelo, who had already invested a huge amount of time and his own money, was furious. He felt betrayed and humiliated. In a fit of pique, he fled Rome and returned to his native Florence, vowing never to work for the Pope again. What followed was a comical and tense diplomatic standoff. The Pope, the most powerful man in Christendom, sent a series of increasingly threatening letters to the government of Florence, demanding they send his artist back. "He has played a trick on us," Julius thundered, "which we should never have played on him." The Pope was used to commanding armies and having kings bow to him. The defiance of a single, stubborn artist was infuriating. The Florentine government convinced Michelangelo to go and make his peace with the Pope. They met in the city of Bologna, which Julius had just conquered. Michelangelo, fearing for his life, was brought before the Pope, who glowered at him. "So," Julius grumbled, "instead of coming to us, you waited for us to come to you." Michelangelo begged for forgiveness, and the Pope, after a tense moment, pardoned him. But when Michelangelo returned to Rome, Julius had a new project for him. He pointed up at the vast, plain, barrel-vaulted ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. "I want you to paint it," he commanded. Michelangelo was horrified. "I am a sculptor, not a painter," he protested. He insisted it was a job for Raphael, a younger artist who was already a celebrated painter. He even suspected that his rivals, who were jealous of his talent, had put the Pope up to it, hoping he would fail miserably at a task for which he was not trained. But you did not say no to Julius II. Reluctantly, Michelangelo accepted the commission. What followed was for years of grueling, solitary labor. The popular image, which you've probably seen in movies, is of Michelangelo lying on his back to paint. This is a myth, one of the most persistent in art history. It's a small but important detail. In reality, he designed a special scaffolding system that allowed him to stand upright, but his head was craned back at a painful angle for hours on end, day after day. He wrote a poem about his misery, describing how the paint dripped down onto his face and how his spine was twisted into a permanent knot. He was working in the difficult medium of fresco, where you have to paint on a section of wet plaster before it dries. It required incredible speed and precision. The relationship with the Pope remained stormy. Julius was constantly climbing up the scaffolding to check on the progress, complaining that it was taking too long. "When will you be finished?" he would demand. "When I can," Michelangelo would retort. At one point, according to a contemporary biographer, the Pope got so angry that he hit Michelangelo with his staff. The artist immediately stopped working and threatened to leave again. Julius had to send his chamberlain with a bag of money and a formal apology to coax him back. This fraught relationship leads to a key historical debate. How much creative control did Michelangelo actually have? Was he just a hired hand, meticulously executing a complex theological program dictated by the Pope and his advisors, or was he the true creative genius, inventing the iconography himself? The truth is likely a combination of both. The overall theme, the story of Genesis, from the creation to the drunkenness of Noah, flanked by prophets and sibylles, was almost certainly provided by the Vatican. But the execution, the dynamic compositions, the revolutionary depiction of the human body, and the sheer emotional power of the figures, that was all Michelangelo. He turned a commission he never wanted into his defining masterpiece. He took the traditional story of Genesis and infused it with a sense of cosmic drama and human pathos that had never been seen before. The central panel, the creation of Adam, with the two outstretched fingers almost touching, has become one of the most iconic images in all of Western art. When the ceiling was finally unveiled in 1512, the effect was electrifying. People were stunned by its scale, its beauty, and its power. Julius II, for all his impatience and bullying, had pushed his artist to create something for the ages. He had brought in his monument, not in marble on the floor of a church, but in paint, high above the heads of the faithful, a permanent testament to his own grand vision and the tortured genius of his favorite artist. But all this art cost money, a lot of money, and Julius Caesar's successor would have to find a new, and deeply controversial, way to pay the bills. When the fearsome warrior Pope Julius II dies, the College of Cardinals decides it's time for a change of pace. They are tired of war, tired of the Pope's explosive temper, and tired of being dragged along on military campaigns. They want a Pope who is calm, cultured, and, most of all, peaceful. They choose Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, and in doing so, they get exactly what they wanted and a whole lot more. The papacy of Leo X is about to begin, and it's going to be one long, incredibly expensive party. You're back in Rome, but the city's mood has changed dramatically. The stern, martial energy of Julius II has evaporated, replaced by a sense of light-hearted revelry. Leo X is a Medici, from the great banking and drooling family of Florence. H.E.S., the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and he was raised from birth in a world of art, literature, and lavish sophistication. He was made a cardinal at the age of 13, and now, at 37, H.E.S. the Pope. He is famously quoted as having said upon his election, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it, he did. Leo was a man of impeccable taste and boundless extravagance. The grim, businesslike atmosphere of the Vatican under Julius is gone. Now the halls are filled with musicians, poets, artists, and scholars. Leo is a passionate patron of the arts, but unlike Julius, who saw art as a tool of power, Leo sees it as a source of pleasure. He continues the great projects started by his predecessor, the rebuilding of the decoration of the Vatican apartments by Raphael, but he adds his own flair for opulence. The papal court becomes the most glittering and entertaining in all of Europe. Leo loves hunting, and he would stage elaborate hunting expeditions in the countryside around Rome, with hundreds of attendants and specially trained hunting leopards. He loves music and maintained a choir and orchestra of the finest musicians in the world. He loves theatre and would stage comedies, often quite risque ones, for the entertainment of his court. His banquets were the stuff of legend, far surpassing the Borgias in elegance, if not in outright debauchery. Courses would be designed to delight and surprise the guests. One famous story tells of a dinner where each course was followed by a serving of gold-coated pills, which were meant to aid digestion. It was pure, unadulterated spectacle. One of the most famous and bizarre residents of Leo's court was his pet Hanno. Hanno was a white elephant, a gift from the King of Portugal. Leo adored the animal. Hanno was housed in a special enclosure in the Vatican and was a star attraction in papal processions, often decked out in elaborate, jewel-encrusted harnesses. The elephant became a symbol of the playful, exotic, and slightly absurd nature of Leo's court. When Hanno eventually died, the Pope was heartbroken. He commissioned the great artist Raphael to paint a memorial portrait of his beloved pet, which has since been lost, and wrote the elephant's epitaph himself. The tomb of a pet elephant in the Vatican, it's a small, quirky detail that perfectly encapsulates the unique atmosphere of Leo's papacy. But all of this, the art, the music, the hunting, the parties, the pet elephant, cost an astronomical amount of money. Leo X was a terrible financial manager. He spent money with a reckless abandon that made even the cardinals' heads spin. He inherited a full papal treasury from the fiscally prudent Julius II. Within a few years, it was completely empty. He then proceeded to spend the entire income of his own papacy, and then the entire income of his own papacy, and then the entire income of his successor's papacy, which he borrowed from bankers at exorbitant rates. One contemporary satirist quipped that Leo had squandered 3 fortunes: his predecessors, his own, and his successors. This leads to a debate among historians: was Leo X a truly great Renaissance pope, a man who fostered a golden age of art and culture, or was he a frivolous, irresponsible spendthrift who presided over the moral and financial bankruptcy of the papacy? The answer: His court was a vibrant center of artistic creation, the high watermark of the High Renaissance in Rome. But his inability to control his spending created a desperate need for new sources of revenue. He had to pay for the ongoing construction of the new street, Peter's Basilica. He had to pay the artists. He had to pay for his parties. And he had to pay the bankers who were charging him crippling interest rates. To solve this cash flow problem, Leo turned to a financial instrument that had been used by popes before. But he was about to take it to a whole new level. It was a way to raise vast sums of money from the faithful all across Europe. It was a promise of spiritual relief, a certificate that offered a path out of divine punishment. It was called an indulgence, and the way his agents marketed it would light a fuse that would blow the Christian world apart. The party at the Vatican is in full swing, but the bills are coming due. Leo X, the pleasure-loving Medici Pope, has a massive cash flow problem. The construction of the new street, Peter's Basilica, the grand project inherited from Julius II, is a financial black hole, swallowing up money at an astonishing rate. Add to that Leo's own extravagant lifestyle, and the papal treasury is running on fumes. He needs money, and he needs it now. The solution he turns to is a practice as old as the Crusades, but one he and his agents will push to an industrial and deeply cynical scale: the sale of indulgences. To understand the controversy, you first need to get your head around the theology, which is a bit complicated. In the Catholic doctrine of your time, when a person sins, they face two kinds of punishment. The eternal punishment, hell, can be forgiven through confession and absolution. But there's also a temporal punishment, a kind of spiritual debt that has to be paid, either here on earth through acts of penance, or after death in a place called purgatory. Purgatory is a temporary state of purification where souls are cleansed by fire before they can enter heaven. It's not hell, but it's not pleasant. An indulgence was a way to reduce the amount of time a soul had to spend in purgatory. The Pope, according to the doctrine, had access to a treasury of merits, a kind of spiritual bank account filled with the infinite good deeds of Christ and the surplus good deeds of the saints. He could dispense these merits to the faithful, effectively cancelling out their temporal punishment. Originally, indulgences were granted for pious acts, like going on a crusade or making a pilgrimage, but over time, it became common to grant them in exchange for a monetary donation to a worthy cause, like, say, building a giant new church in Rome. This is where things start to get murky. Is it a donation, or is it a purchase for the average person? The distinction was blurry at best. And under Leo X, that blurriness would be exploited with ruthless efficiency. The campaign to sell indulgences to fund Street Peter's rolled out across Europe, but it was in Germany that it reached its most aggressive and scandalous form. The man in charge of the German indulgence campaign was a young, ambitious German nobleman named Albert of Brandenburg. Albert was the perfect partner for the Pope because he had his own massive debt problem. Through a series of political deals, he had managed to become the archbishop of 2 different territories and the administrator of a third. Holding multiple bishoprics was against canon law, and it required a massive fee to the Pope for a special dispensation. Albert didn't have the money, so he borrowed it from the powerful Fugger banking family. Here's the deal they struck, a masterpiece of cynical finance that historians still marvel at. The Pope authorized Albert to sell the street Peter's indulgence throughout his territories. The money raised would be split 50 Maywushu, half would go to the Pope to build the basilica. The other half would go to Albert so he could pay back the Fugger bankers. It was a joint venture between the Pope, an archbishop, and a bank to sell spiritual relief to the German people. A representative from the Fugger Bank even traveled with the indulgence preachers to make sure they got their cut directly. This is where you encounter the most notorious figure in the whole affair, a Dominican friar named Johann Tietzel. Tietzel was the master salesman, the star preacher of the indulgence campaign. He would travel from town to town, setting up his stand in the market square with the papal bull of indulgence displayed prominently. He was a showman. He would deliver fiery sermons, painting terrifying pictures of the torments of purgatory. He would describe the screams of his listeners' dead relatives, trapped in the cleansing fires begging for relief, and then he would deliver his famous sales pitch. While the official doctrine was nuanced, Tietzel's message was brutally simple. He boiled it down to a catchy, unforgettable jingle as soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. This was the key innovation, and the source of the scandal. T. Edsel and other indulgence preachers were marketing these certificates not just for the buyer's own sins, but for the sins of their deceased loved ones. You could buy an indulgence and instantly release your mother's soul from the fiery torments of purgatory. It was an incredibly powerful emotional appeal. How could you refuse? It was also, in the eyes of many theologians, a gross perversion of Christian doctrine. It turned salvation into a simple commercial transaction. The whole system reeked of corruption. And here's a fascinating, little-known detail that shows the bureaucratic nature of the system. There was a sliding scale of prices for the indulgences. The fee was adjusted based on your social rank and income. A king or a queen would pay 25 gold florins. An abbot or a count would pay 10th. A merchant with a modest income might pay 1. And the very poor, who couldn't afford anything, could pay with prayers and fasting, though this option wasn't heavily advertised. It was a divinely sanctioned get-out-of-jail-free card, with prices tailored to what the market would bear. The debate among historians is not whether this system was corrupt, it clearly was, but about how widespread the opposition was before it all exploded. Was the man who would light the fuse a lone voice crying in the wilderness, or was he simply giving voice to a deep and widespread resentment that was already simmering just beneath the surface? The evidence suggests the latter. Many local princes, priests, and ordinary people in Germany were deeply resentful of the way vast sums of money were being hoovered up from their lands and sent south to Rome to fund the lavish projects of a foreign pope. The soil was fertile for rebellion. All it needed was a single spark, and that spark was about to be provided by an obscure, devout, and deeply troubled Augustinian monk who had become obsessed with the nature of sin, faith, and salvation. Far away from the glittering, debt-ridden court of Pope Leo X, in the small provincial university town of Wittenberg, Germany, a man is having a spiritual crisis. He is not a prince or a cardinal, but a university professor and monk named Martin Luther. He is devout, obsessive, and tormented by a single, terrifying question: how can a sinful human being ever be seen as righteous in the eyes of a perfectly just God? His personal struggle with this question will soon collide with Johann Tietzel's vulgar sales campaign, and the result will be a theological explosion that shatters the unity of Christendom forever. You find yourself in Luther's study. It's a simple, austere room. There are no gold-leafed books or fine tapestries here. Just stacks of scripture theological texts, and the ever-present chill of a stone tower. Luther is a man wrestling with his own soul. He has tried everything the Church recommends to achieve salvation. He fasts, he prays, he goes to confession for hours on end, exhausting his confessors with his meticulous cataloguing of every tiny sin. But none of it brings him peace. He is acutely aware of his own sinfulness and terrified of God's judgment. He feels that no amount of good works, no penance, no purchased indulgence could ever be enough to bridge the gap between his own imperfection and God's perfection. Then one day, while studying the letters of St. Paul, he has a breakthrough, an epiphany that will change the course of his life and the world. Reading Paul's epistle to the Romans, he is struck by the phrase, "The just shall live by faith." Suddenly, it all becomes clear. Salvation is not something you can earn through good works or buy from an indulgence preacher. It is a free gift from God, granted to those who have faith in Jesus Christ. This doctrine, known as justification by faith alone, becomes the central pillar of his theology. It is a liberating, revolutionary idea. It means that the entire apparatus of penance, purgatory, and indulgences is, at best, a distraction, and at worst, a fraudulent scheme. It's from this theological perspective that Luther watches with horror and disgust as Johann Tietzel sets up his shop just across the border from Wittenberg. He hears the jingles, he sees the people flocking to buy these worthless pieces of paper, believing they can purchase their salvation. To Luther, this isn't just a corruption, it is a blasphemous lie that is leading people's souls to damnation. He feels compelled, as a priest and a doctor of theology, to speak out. On October 31, 1517, he does just that. According to tradition, he walks up to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg and nails a document to it. This document is his disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences, better known as the 95 Theses. Now, here's a small but significant detail that historians love to debate. Did Luther actually nail the theses to the church, or the image is incredibly powerful, a lone monk striking a blow against a corrupt church with a hammer? It has become the founding myth of the Protestant Reformation. However, the first account of this event was written decades later by Luther's friend and collaborator, Philip Melanchthon, who wasn't even in Wittenberg at the time. Some historians argue it never happened. They suggest that Luther, following standard academic practice, simply mailed his theses to his superior, Archbishop Albert of Brandenburg, the man who was splitting the indulgence money with the Pope, to propose a scholarly debate. The church door in Wittenberg acted as a kind of university bulletin board, so posting theses there wasn't a defiant act in itself, whether he nailed them up or just mailed them. The effect was the same. The 95 Theses were not a declaration of war. They were written in Latin, the language of scholars, and were framed as points for academic discussion. They are surprisingly moderate. He doesn't attack the Pope directly at first. He questions the efficacy of indulgences and the Pope's authority to release souls from purgatory. Thesis Aetixis is a classic example of his pointed, but still respectful tone. Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of true believers rather than with his own money? But he had unknowingly touched a raw nerve. Thanks to the new technology of the printing press, his theses were quickly translated from Latin into German and printed in mass quantities. Within weeks, they had spread throughout Germany. Within months, all of Europe was talking about them. What started as a scholarly debate had become a full-blown popular movement. Luther had given voice to the deep-seated resentment many Germans felt towards the financial exploitation of the papacy. Back in Rome, the response from Leo X and the papal court was dismissive. At first, they saw it as nothing more than a monk's quarrel, a petty squabble between the Augustinian order Luthers and the Dominican order Tietzels. Leo is famously, and perhaps apocryphal lie, said to have dismissed the whole affair as the ramblings of a drunken German who would feel differently when he is sober. They completely underestimated the power of Luther's ideas and the depth of the anger he had tapped into. They sent theologians to debate him. But these debates only served to push Luther into more radical positions. He was forced to defend his ideas, and in doing so, he began to question indulgences, but the authority of the Pope himself, arguing that Scripture alone, sola Scriptura, was the ultimate source of religious truth. The die was cast. The Pope eventually issued a papal bull condemning Luther's teachings and threatening him with excommunication if he did not recant. Luther responded in the most defiant way possible. In a public gathering outside the walls of Wittenberg, he burned the papal bull. There was no going back now. The drunken German monk was not backing down, and the opulent world of the Renaissance popes was about to come crashing down in flames. The fire Martin Luther lit in Germany is now raging out of control. The ideas of the Reformation are spreading like wildfire across Northern Europe, challenging not just the Pope's spiritual authority, but also his political power. Back in Rome, the successors of Leo X are struggling to contain the crisis. They are dealing with heresy, political upheaval, and a catastrophic loss of revenue from Germany. But while they are focused on this distant theological threat, a much more immediate and terrifying danger is gathering on the horizon. The very political games the popes have been playing for a century are about to produce a disaster of unimaginable proportions, an event so horrific it will mark the symbolic end of the High Renaissance in Rome. The sack of Rome is coming. To understand how this happened, you have to look at the political mess the popes had helped create. The new pope is Clement VII, and he is another Medici, the cousin of Leo X. He is intelligent and sophisticated, but also notoriously indecisive, a fatal flaw in a time of crisis. He finds himself caught in a brutal power struggle between the two great titans of Europe, King Francis I of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Italy is their battlefield. Both monarchs want to control the rich and strategically important peninsula. Pope Clement, in a desperate attempt to maintain the independence of the Papal States, dithers. He tries to play the two great powers off against each other, shifting his allegiance from one side to the other. It's the classic papal strategy, but this time it backfires spectacularly. In 1526, he makes a fateful decision, forming the League of Cognac to try and dot to the emperor's forces out of Italy. The Emperor Charles V is furious. He's a devout Catholic, but he is also a hard-headed ruler who will not tolerate betrayal, even from the Pope. His imperial army in northern Italy, a massive, multinational force, is now at war with the Pope. This army is a ticking time bomb. It's made up of Spanish regulars, who are fiercely loyal Catholics but also professional soldiers who expect to be paid Italian mercenaries, who fight for whoever pays them the most and, most dangerously, a large contingent of German land's neck-deep fierce, battle-hardened mercenaries, many of whom are fervent Lutherans. These German soldiers have a special, burning hatred for the Pope. In their eyes, Rome is not the holy city, it is the seat of the Antichrist, the source of all the corruption that has defiled the Church. They have been fired up by years of Reformation preaching. They dream of washing their hands in the blood of priests and cardinals. And here's the crucial factor: the army isn't being paid. The Emperor Charles V, busy fighting wars on multiple fronts across his vast empire, is short on cash. The army in Italy is restless, mutinous, and starving. They have only one thing on their mind: plunder. They need a rich city to sack to get their wages. And their commanders, seeing an opportunity to punish the treacherous Pope and appease their troops, point them south. Pope Clement V is blissfully, tragically unaware of the scale of the danger. He thinks he has negotiated a truce. He dismisses most of his own troops to save money, leaving Rome virtually defenseless. He doesn't believe the emperor's army will dare to attack the holy city of Christendom. On the morning of May 6, 1527, the imperial army arrives at the walls of Rome. You are a citizen of Rome, waking up to the sound of trumpets and alarms. A thick fog hangs over the city, providing cover for the attackers. The assault is chaotic and brutal. The city's defenses are thin. The Swiss Guard, the Pope's personal bodyguard, makes a heroic last stand on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, fighting to the last man to allow the Pope to escape. You see Pope Clement, in his white papal robes, running for his life across the Piazzetta de Borgo. This is a fascinating and little-known piece of Vatican architecture that saved his life. The Piazzetta is an elevated, fortified corridor about half a mile long that connects the Vatican Palace to the massive, impregnable fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo. It was built precisely for this purpose, to serve as a papal escape route. As the Pope flees, the sounds of slaughter are all around him. He makes it into the fortress just as the drawbridge is raised, a prisoner in his own city. The historical debate here centers on intentionality. Did the Emperor Charles V order the sack of Rome? Or, a mutiny that he couldn't control? The official line from the Emperor was that he was horrified by the event and that it was an unfortunate consequence of his troops' mutiny. Most historians agree that he probably didn't give a direct order to sack the city in such a brutal fashion. However, he created the conditions for it to happen. He failed to pay his troops, he stoked their anger against the Pope, and he certainly wasn't unhappy to see the Pope so thoroughly humiliated. He may not have lit the match, but he built the bonfire and soaked it in gasoline. With the Pope wrapped in the city's defenders overwhelmed, all restraint is lost. The starving, angry, and fanatically anti-papal army pours into the city. For the next month, Rome is subjected to an orgy of violence, destruction, and sacrilege that shocks the Christian world. The eternal city becomes a living hell. The gates are broken. The defenders are dead. The Pope is a helpless spectator, watching from the battlements of Castel Sant'Angelo as his city is devoured. The sack of Rome is not a disciplined military occupation. It is a descent into pure, unrestrained chaos. For weeks, you are trapped in a nightmare, hiding in cellars and attics, listening to the sounds of a city being torn apart piece by bloody piece. The Imperial Army, a volatile cocktail of Spanish Catholics and German Lutherans, is completely out of control. The commanders have lost all authority. The soldiers are driven by a trinity of motives: greed, hunger, and hatred. They fan out across the city, and the sack begins. Every house, every palace, every church is broken into and plundered. Priceless works of art are smashed or vandalized. Ancient manuscripts from the Vatican Library are used as bedding for horses. Relics are stolen from their jeweled containers, the sacred bones scattered on the floor. The violence against the people of Rome is relentless. Citizens are tortured to reveal the location of their hidden valuables. Nuns are dragged from their convents. Priests get particularly for the Lutheran Landsknechte, who see them as servants of the Antichrist. The Germans stage mock religious processions, dressing up in stolen cardinals' robes, getting drunk on communion wine, and parodying the Mass in the holy spaces of St. Peter's itself. One group even holds a mock conclave and proclaims Martin Luther as the new pope. It's sacrilege on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. You witness scenes that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The streets, once filled with pilgrims and merchants, are now littered with bodies. The Tiber River, which once carried away the city's waste, is now choked with the dead. The plague, which always lurks in the city's insanitary corners, breaks out among both the citizens and the soldiers, adding another layer of horror to the ordeal. Rome, the glorious center of the Renaissance, has become a charnel house. This event is not just a military disaster, it's a profound psychological shock to the entire culture of the Renaissance. The optimistic humanism that had characterized the age, the belief in human dignity, the celebration of classical beauty, the confidence in a bright future is shattered. The sack is seen by many as a divine judgment, a punishment for the sins of the papacy, for the hubris and decadence of the popes of the past century. Confident world that Leo X had presided over now seems like a foolish, fragile dream. A small but poignant detail illustrates the human cost for the artistic community. Many of the great artists who had flocked to Rome under the patronage of Julius II and Leo X are caught in the chaos. The painter Parmigianino is said to have been so absorbed just breaking into his studio until they were standing right behind him. They were so impressed by his painting that they spared his life, but still robbed him of everything he owned. Benvenuto Cellini, a famous goldsmith and sculptor and notorious braggart, claimed in his autobiography that he was one of the defenders of Castel Sant'Angelo and that he personally fired the cannon that killed one of the enemy commanders. It's a classic Cellini story, probably an exaggeration, but it captures the sense that everyone, even the artists, was swept up in the violence. The sack finally winds down not because of any order, but because there is nothing left to plunder and the plague is killing the soldiers as fast as the citizens. After a month of horror, the army, laden with loot and decimated by disease, finally stumbles out of the ruined city. Pope Clement V remains a prisoner in Castel Sant'Angelo for 7 months. He is eventually released after agreeing to pay a massive ransom and cede large territories to the emperor. He emerges into a city that is a ghost of its former self. The population has been halved. The economy is destroyed. The great artistic community has fled. The glittering Rome of the High Renaissance is gone, covered in a shroud of ash and trauma. The historical debate here concerns the long-term consequences of the sack. Some historians see it as a definitive turning point, the single event that ended the Italian Renaissance. They argue that the creative energy and political independence of the Italian city-states were rushed, paving the way for centuries of foreign domination. The center of European culture and power began to shift north, away from the Mediterranean. Other historians argue for a more nuanced view. They suggest that while the sack was a horrific trauma, the Renaissance was already undergoing a transformation. The political and religious crises were already well underway. They see the sack not as the cause of the decline, but as its most brutal and dramatic symptom. It didn't kill the Renaissance, but it certainly marked the end of its most optimistic and flamboyant chapter. As you walk through the desolate, debris-strewn streets of the ruined city, the message is clear. The grand political games of the popes, their alliances and betrayals, their wars and their ambitions to be kings have led to this. The pursuit of temporal power has resulted in the near-total destruction of their own capital. The church has hit rock bottom. From these ashes, a new, more sober, and more defensive form of Catholicism will have to rise. The party is definitively over. The time for penance has begun. The Rome you walk through now is a city of ghosts. The trauma of the 1527 sack has left a deep, unhealable scar. The glittering confidence of the High Renaissance has been replaced by a mood of fear, sobriety, and introspection. The Catholic Church is wounded, its prestige shattered, its capital city in ruins, and half of Northern Europe lost to the Protestant Reformation. The popes of the mid-16th century can no longer afford the decadent parties of a Leo X or the purely secular wars of a Julius II. The game has changed. This is an age of crisis, and the Church must either reform itself or risk complete collapse. This period is what historians call the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation. It's a complex movement, and the debate over its name is revealing. Is it Counter-Reformation, a purely reactionary movement designed to fight the spread of Protestantism, or is it Catholic Reformation, a genuine, internally driven movement for reform that was already underway long before Luther, but was kicked into high gear by the crisis? The truth is, it was both. It was a movement that looked both inward, to cleanse the Church of its own corruption, and outward, to combat the theological challenge of the Protestants. The central event of this Catholic renewal is a single, marathon-like Church Council of Trent. The popes for a century had been terrified of councils, seeing them as a threat to their own authority. But now, with the emperor and other Catholic rulers demanding action, they have no choice. The council is convened in the small northern Italian city of Trent, and it will meet on and off for nearly 2 decades, from 1545 to 1563. Imagine yourself in the Cathedral of Trent. The atmosphere is nothing like the political conclaves of the Borgia era. This is a solemn, serious affair. Cardinals, bishops, and theologians from all over Catholic Europe are gathered here to hammer out the future of the Church. The debates are long, complex, and often heated. They have two main tasks. First, they need to reaffirm Catholic doctrine and refute the core tenets of Protestantism. On this front, the Council gives no ground. They reject Luther's idea of justification by faith and good works are necessary for salvation. They declare that Scripture and Church tradition are equal sources of authority, not Scripture alone. They reaffirm the existence of purgatory and the validity of indulgences, though they condemn the selling of them. They double down on traditional Catholic theology. There will be no compromise with the Protestants. The split in Western Christianity is now permanent and official. The second task is where the real Reformation happens, cleaning up the institutional corruption that had allowed the crisis to happen in the first place. The Council passes a series of sweeping reform decrees aimed directly at abuses that have been rampant for centuries. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, is strictly forbidden. The practice of bishops holding multiple dioceses for financial gain is abolished. A strict new moral code is imposed on the clergy. And, most importantly, the Council orders the establishment of seminaries in every diocese to properly train priests. No longer would it be enough for a priest to be a nobleman's poorly educated second son. They now had to be well versed in theology, fluent in Latin, and capable of preaching and teaching their flock. This leads to a small but significant change you would notice at the parish level. The Council of Trent placed a new emphasis on the importance of the sermon. In many medieval churches, preaching was a rare event. The Mass was the central ritual, but it was in Latin, a language most people didn't understand. The reformers at Trent realized they had been out-preached by the Protestants. They mandated that bishops and priests should preach regularly in the vernacular, explaining the Scripture and teaching the catechism to the laity. The pulpit became a central feature in new church design, a sign of this renewed focus on religious education. The popes who preside over this new era are a different breed. Men like Pauli, II, the petticoat cardinal from the Borgia era, now a respected reformer, Pauli the harsh, unbending zealot, and Pius the deeply ascetic former inquisitor who wore a hair shirt under his papal robes, are a world away from the Renaissance princes. They are stern, disciplined, and focused on restoring order and piety. The spirit of the Counter-Reformation also gives rise to a new and powerful religious order, the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. Founded by the Spanish nobleman turned mystic Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits are the special forces of the revitalized papacy. They are highly educated, disciplined, and take a special vow of obedience to the Pope. They become the Church's most effective agents, fanning out across the world as missionaries to win back territory from the Protestants in Europe and convert new souls in Asia and the Americas. The Rome that emerges from this period is a more sober, more orderly, and more overtly religious city. The art and architecture of the new era, the Baroque style, is still magnificent, but it's a different kind of magnificent. It's an art of high drama, intense emotion, and persuasive power, designed to awe the faithful and proclaim the triumph of the Catholic faith. But this new Reformed Church is also more rigid and authoritarian. The Counter-Reformation also brings the expansion of the Roman Inquisition and the creation of the Index of Forbidden Books, a list of works. The open, sometimes chaotic intellectual climate of the Renaissance is replaced by a stricter control over thought. The Church had put its house in order, but in doing so, it had also become less tolerant. The sinful popes were gone, but so was some of the freedom they had, perhaps unintentionally, allowed. As the dust settles from the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, you find yourself looking back at the era of the sinful popes from a distance. The world they inhabited, that volatile, brilliant, and brutal world of Renaissance Rome, seems almost like a different planet. The figures of Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X now loom as historical giants, their reputations tangled in a web of fact, fiction, and propaganda. It's time to ask the big question, the one that historians still grapple with today. How should we judge these men? Were they simply monsters? Were they evil, cynical hypocrites who perverted the holiest office on earth for their own personal gain? This is the traditional view, the black legend that was crafted by their enemies and has been enthusiastically embraced by popular culture ever since. It gives us clear villains: the poisoning, incestuous Borgias, the bloodthirsty Julius II, the gluttonous Leo X. It's a story of shocking contrasts, of unholy men in holy rogues. And there is, of course, a great deal of truth to it. They did buy the papacy. They did father children. They did wage wars, plot assassinations, and live in obscene luxury while preaching a gospel of poverty and humility. But, as you look closer, a more complex and, in some ways, more unsettling picture emerges. Perhaps judging them by our modern standards of religious leadership is a form of historical malpractice. To understand them, you have to see them in the context of their own time. They were not just priests, they were princes. And they were operating in one of the most Renaissance Italy. In this world, a ruler who was not ruthless, who did not use deceit, who did not put his own family and state's interest first, did not survive. The popes saw themselves as the guardians of the Church's independence. To maintain that independence, they believed they needed a strong, centralized papal state, and to build that state, they had to behave like the other Italian rulers, the Sforzas in Milan, the Medici in Florence, the kings of Naples. They had to play the game. Put forward by more revisionist historians is that their sins were not the personal failings of uniquely evil men, but rather the necessary tools of statecraft in a brutal age. Alexander VI's nepotism was a political strategy to create a loyal power base. Julius I's wars were a way to secure the Church's territories from foreign invaders. Leo X's extravagance was part of the soft power of a Renaissance prince, projecting an image of magnificence and cultural superiority. This leads to the central, and still fiercely debated, question of their legacy. Can we separate the sinner from the patron? Can you condemn Julius II for his wars while still marveling at the Sistine Chapel ceiling that he commissioned? This is the great paradox of the Renaissance papacy. These corrupt, worldly, and often brutal men were also among the greatest patrons of art and culture the world has ever known. They funded the masterpieces of Michelangelo, Raphael, Rembrandt, and countless others. They rebuilt Rome from a medieval backwater into the glorious city we know today. Does the beauty they created somehow excuse their sins? Of course not. But it complicates the verdict. This is the argument of historical necessity. Some historians contend that the sublime art of the High Renaissance could only have been produced under these specific conditions: a class of fabulously wealthy and powerful patrons, a competitive artistic marketplace, and a worldview that saw the creation of beauty as a legitimate expression of power. A pious, reform-minded pope like the ones who came after the sack of Rome would never have had the inclination, or the funds, to hire Michelangelo to spend for years painting a ceiling. The beauty and the sin, in this view, are inextricably linked. Then there's the question of their impact on the Church itself. It's easy to say they caused the Reformation. Leo X's greedy indulgence campaign was certainly the spark that lit Luther's fire. But was the schism inevitable here? Historians are divided. Some argue that the corruption of the papacy was so profound and had been going on for so long that a major rebellion was bound to happen eventually. The Renaissance popes were simply the ones left holding the bag when the system finally broke. Others suggest that the split could have been avoided. They argue that if the popes, particularly Leo X, had responded to Luther's initial challenge with serious dialogue and a genuine commitment to reform, instead of with haughty dismissals and threats, a compromise might have been possible. In this view, the great failure of the Renaissance popes was not their personal immorality, but their political short-sightedness. They were so focused on the game of Italian politics that they failed to see the much larger spiritual crisis brewing in the north until it was too late. Ultimately, there is no easy answer. These men were not simple villains. They were complex figures, products of their time, a tangled mess of faith and ambition, sin and splendor. They were worldly princes who happened to wear the robes of the Vicar of Christ. They sought to build an earthly kingdom for the Church, and in doing so, they nearly destroyed its spiritual one. They were in the end both the patrons and the gravidogs of their own golden age. And as you stand in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, the very building that embodies both their grandest artistic ambitions and their most fatal spiritual failures, you are left to ponder the enduring, uncomfortable legacy of the sinful Pope. The Rome used and in now is a city transformed, a place both familiar and profoundly different from the one you first entered. The chaotic, vibrant, and dangerous energy of the Renaissance has receded, replaced by the grand, solemn order of the Baroque era. The popes still rule, but their role in the world has fundamentally changed. The story of the sinful popes is over, but its echoes reverberate everywhere, in the stones of the city and in the structure of the modern world. As you walk through the vast, embracing colonnade of St. Peter's Square, designed by the great Baroque artist Bernini, you see the ultimate symbol of the post-Reformation papacy. It is magnificent, powerful, and designed to inspire awe, but it's a different kind of power. It's the power of persuasion, of spectacle, and of renewed spiritual confidence. Now seems like a fantasy from a distant, almost mythical past. The temporal power of the papacy, the great obsession of the Renaissance popes, begins a long, slow decline. The papal states, which Cesare Borgia and Julius II fought so hard to conquer and consolidate, still exist, but they are increasingly an anachronism in a Europe of powerful, centralized nation-states. The Pope is no longer a major player in the great game of European power politics. His voice in the courts of kings has diminished. The treaties that end the great religious wars of the 17th century are signed with little to no input from the papacy. The Pope's authority is now almost entirely confined to the spiritual realm. In a way, Martin Luther got his wish. The Pope has been forced to become less of a king and more of a priest. This shift has a profound effect on the nature of the papacy itself. The great Italian families no longer see the papal throne as the ultimate dynastic prize. The office becomes less of a political spoil and more of a spiritual burden. The popes of the later centuries are, for the most part, pious, elderly, and administratively focused men. The era of the scandalous, nepotistic pope who treated the church as a family business is well and truly over. The reforms of the Council of Trent, born from the ashes of the sack and the trauma of the Reformation, have worked. The institution has been cleaned up, its rules tightened, its mission refocused. And here's a final, quirky detail that illustrates this long decline of papal worldly power. In the 1872, during the unification of Italy, the new secular kingdom of Italy annexed the city of Rome, making it its capital. Pope Pius IX, stripped of the last vestiges of the papal states, declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican. For almost 60 years, the popes refused to leave the Vatican, a self-imposed exile to protest their loss of temporal power. With the signing of the Lateran and treaty with the Italian government, that the modern state of Vatican City was created. This tiny, 110-acre sovereign state is the last, symbolic remnant of the vast territories the Renaissance popes ruled and fought for. The historical debate that lingers is one of legacy and causation. Did the sinful popes in their very excess create the conditions for a more modern, more spiritually focused church? It's a deeply ironic thought. Could it be that by pushing the system to its absolute breaking point, they forced a necessary and long overdue correction? Some historians might argue a version of this, suggesting that the crisis they provoked was a form of shock therapy. The church had to nearly die to be reborn. The corruption of the Borgias and the Medici popes created the fertile ground for both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, to movements that would profoundly shape the modern Western world. So as you stand in the twilight, watching the lights come on across the city, you see the story's end. The popes lost their kingdom, but in doing so, perhaps they regained their moral authority. The dream of a papal monarchy died, but the papacy itself survived, transforming into the global spiritual institution it is today. The sinful popes, with their ambition and their art, their wars and their scandals, ultimately failed in their own grand project. But in their failure, they left behind a world forever changed, a Rome of breathtaking beauty, and a story that continues to fascinate, horrify, and instruct us even centuries later. The river of time has washed over their world, leaving behind only the monuments and the memories, faint echoes of a time when the Vicar of Christ could be the most dangerous man on earth. The last echo of the story fades, leaving only the soft hum of the fan in your room. The journey is over. You can feel the cobblestones of Renaissance Rome dissolve beneath your feet, the scent of incense and wood smoke giving way to the familiar, comforting smell of your own pillow. The larger-than-life figures, the scheming Alexander, the fearsome Julius, the extravagant Leo, recede into the mists of history, their loud ambitions finally silenced at war, names in a heavy book. Your mind, which a moment ago was filled with the clash of armies and the whispers of conspiracy, begins to soften and slow. The sharp edges of the day's worries start to blur, their colors fading into a gentle gray. You are floating now in that peaceful, weightless space between wakefulness and sleep. The story was a bridge, a quiet path that led you away from the noise of the present and delivered you to the threshold of your own inner world. Let the rhythm of your breathing be the only guide now. A slow, easy inhale and a long, gentle exhale. Feel the tension release from your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. Each breath is a soft wave, washing away the remnants of the day, carrying you further out into a calm, quiet sea of stillness. The characters and conflicts of the past are no longer your concern. They have played their part. Now, the stage is empty, the theater is dark, and only a profound and gentle quiet remains. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are drifting peacefully toward the shores of slumber. The end of the article. Good night.